Hey, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to another ETHOnline Summit. So today we're really excited to do a summit on the impact that Ethereum is having on our world and different aspects of what Ethereum has been able to achieve over the last few years. I'm your host for today. My name is Jacob. I'm part of the ETH Global team. And yeah, really excited to be here with all of you today. So as I mentioned, today's summit is called The Impact of Ethereum. We're going to dive deep into a bunch of different topics from even the climate to public goods to the future of work, privacy, all kinds of different aspects that Ethereum has started kind of impacting as we kind of explore more of this kind of infinite garden that we're building in together. So we're really excited to have everybody joining us here on ethglobal.tv. Feel free to log in and take part in the conversation there. If you have any questions for any of our speakers as well as the day goes on, drop them there as well. I'll be keeping track. And I'm happy to kind of spend a little bit of time at the end of each talk to kind of surface those questions to our speakers. So yeah, welcome everybody for being here. I want to go over the schedule real quick. So we're kicking off right now with a talk by Scott Moore, which I'm really excited about on Ethereum as a public good. After that, we're going to have Bruno from the Aztec team joining us to chat about Ethereum in the privacy landscape. We're going to have Ben West, also from Gitcoin, chatting at 2:30 p.m. on Beyond the Merge blockchain-enabled climate solutions, which I'm really excited about. Later this afternoon, we have Tina from the Station team and coming to talk about the future of work, and that being on Ethereum. We have Wayne Chang from the Spruce ID Sign In with Ethereum team. I was going to be chatting about Ethereum's identity layer. And then last but not least, we're really excited to have Camilla Russo from the Defiant here to chat about how Ethereum is having impacts on creators and especially to chat about the new movie that she's working on. So that's what our schedule looks like for today. And without further ado, I think we'll just jump right into it and welcome Scott Moore onto the stage. Scott, feel free to unmute and share your video. And yeah, really excited to hear a little bit more about how Ethereum has been kind of building itself into a public good. Yeah, just all the kind of crazy solar punk crypto outcomes of that. So Scott, when you're ready, feel free to share your video and I'll get the screen share out of here. There you are. Hey, Scott, how's it going?
Hey, going well. Can you see the screen here? Does this look okay?
Yeah, everything's great. And I love the art.
Awesome.
So I'll get out of the way and I'm excited for your chat.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate you having me on. I actually have given like a kind of similar version of this talk, and I kind of yielded into this a little bit. But I think the real kind of interesting thing that occurred to me to like kind of talk about in the last few months was, you know, we do have this whole conversation going on about like solar punk and other X punks, and I think there's something interesting to be said just about kind of abstracting away from that and just talking about Ethereum itself as a public good. And so what I wanted to do with this talk is give a bit of context on like, what is this sort of like Plato's cave that we're in around like these different narratives around, you know, solar punk and so forth. How do we, you know, kind of go beyond that towards the core mission that Ethereum is driving? And then how do we talk about, in particular, the ways that Ethereum is kind of allowing us to reimagine what we mean by public goods in the context of Web3, but also just generally, you know, in the context of open source software. And so to start, maybe the easiest thing to do is just to talk about like, what are these different kind of narratives that we've been seeing in the space over the last probably 6 to 12 months. And I think a lot of this stems actually from cyberpunk roots, like back from sort of the Neuromancer era and like the 1980s, even like a little bit before that, which was largely the starting point for cypherpunk, which kind of advocates for strong cryptography, very like intense privacy preserving technologies. John Perry Barlow is probably like one of the most famous members of this movement, and really with the Cyberpunk Manifesto sort of like gave a probably the most compelling and most detailed case for this movement. But ultimately what we've sort of landed on is an evolution of that, which tries to take sort of the individualist notion of cypherpunk and frame it in more of a collective, collaborative way. So the goal of this sort of solar punk ethos, which started back in sort of 2008, was originally really, well, how do we build environmentalism into our sort of like notion of like, tech as a force for good, and how do we find more ways to build a sort of open future where technology facilitates better global sort of coordination. And in Web3, that just seemed to make a lot of sense as a philosophy where, everything we're doing is kind of revolving around coordination. It's all coordination in some sense. And, creating sustainable, convivial, kind of like pro-social connection is something, especially in the DAO space more recently in the last 6 months, that's become very popular to sort of not just talk about, but actually I think take action on. So even beyond Gitcoin, which is mostly where I spend my time, I co-founded that back in 2017. There's lots of projects in the DAO space that are really focused on trying to have more intentional conversations about, the values that we're creating in Web3, in Ethereum in particular, and how we're basically trying to create this connection between people and their environments, whether those are sort of digital spaces where sometimes there's a lot of noise and we want to kind of create a sense of peace, or actually just the physical environment we're in and how we make sure the technology is, facilitating that connection. And obviously, most recently, the merge has been a really big part of that conversation. So I think those are like kind of two, not opposing forces, but like juxtaposed like ideas of what the space is trying to achieve. And I think there's people on kind of both sides of those. And that's what's led to sort of the emergence of lunar punk as a critique of principally the openness of solar punk, the kind of like optimism of solar punk, and it's sort of like failure to really imagine a future in which privacy is front and center, especially in the face of like a lot of real risks if, there is too much openness and transparency, which principally is the risk to a lot of more marginalized populations, folks that, we are trying to make a positive impact for. And so really, it kind of emphasizes privacy and collective action and, still giving people individual agency rather than kind of like, making everyone part of this egregore that, subsumes everything before it. And so it kind of advocates for a more realist approach to the sort of like political landscape, which really is like, goes back to full circle, the sort of cypherpunk movement, John Perry Barlow's ideas. And I think we've kind of gotten to this point where the reason I kind of started with the idea that, these are really interesting ideas, but like maybe not the most useful framings is I think what we've sort of realized is that we're all kind of, to some degree, although this term is a bit controversial in other circles, like techno-optimist. I think everyone here believes that technology can have a fundamentally positive impact on the way that we work together in the long run. And I think that, regardless of approach, if we can build technology that, leads to some collective human thriving, then we should try and do that. And we can do that in a way that kind of, I think, fulfills each of these like narratives without actually creating any sense of conflict. And so I think what's really important for us is to think about then, why is Ethereum part of this techno-optimist movement? And how do we think about these sorts of framings as, kind of like a relevant part of the Ethereum ecosystem, a relevant part of the Ethereum narrative? And I think kind of the juxtaposition right now in a lot of broader tech is between the kind of accelerationist AI sort of like growth at all costs, relatively algorithmic way of thinking about growth and about technology and about techno-optimism. And I think Ethereum fundamentally presents a little bit more of like an agentic, like agent-based form of that, in which we can think more deeply about the way that, we push back on existing social structures or political structures as the only means of coordination, the way in which we kind of push back on large like companies or, kind of large kind of capital like based actors for economic coordination. And then the way that we sort of can reverse these trends towards institutional power. All these are social things. They're, based on us as agents, as people, not necessarily algorithmic things. And I think that's like what's really kind of fascinating about Ethereum and what's really interesting about this sort of particular flavor of techno-optimism that we can try and achieve regardless of the particular implementation details. So I think the fundamental part of Ethereum being a sort of public good comes back to this sort of techno-optimism, the notion that, by building better technology together, we can create this kind of future that we want to see and move beyond this baggage of like previous institutions. And I think, there's actually some really interesting stuff that I'll talk about in a minute about like how that actually reframes our notion of public goods altogether. So, I kind of talked about this, but basically we're scaling coordination. That's what we're doing. We're doing that in a sort of person by person relationship based way. We're trying to figure out ways to coordinate as people at scale, even, regardless of our own sort of like opinions about the world or our own belief systems, or even our own, kind of broader objectives, things we're trying to achieve in the world. We can kind of work together in a pluralistic way to achieve what we want to achieve. And I think what's interesting about the traditional ways of looking at scaling systems is that you kind of, as you build a really massive, like Dunbar's number kind of talks about this 150 numbers of like scale, but really we're talking about systems of like tens of thousands of people, probably hundreds of thousands or millions even. When you get to that scale, it's very hard for people to relate to each other, to feel a sense of solidarity, to like build in a values aligned way. But it is very possible for us to build systems that allow those relationships to grow large enough, to grow carefully enough that, and with enough kind of background technology that we don't lose the sort of underlying structure of the agreements that we've created together, these sort of like shared agreements with each other. And I think this is sort of like the fundamental conceit of like the coordination meme, is that what we mean by coordination is coming to shared agreements with each other in kind of a scaled up way, and doing that towards like effectively sometimes very different ends. But ultimately, I think finding ways to basically scale coordination is at the heart of Ethereum, and kind of to me at the heart of this, like what Ethereum has to offer in a techno-optimist like context. It's, not going and building kind of like, exponentially increasing AI that kind of like subsumes, similar to the sort of Egregore example, like everything around it. It's about building, and whether that's true is a whole conversation in itself. But it's about building kind of systems that allow us to work with each other over time. I think it's very hard to overemphasize how hard a problem that is. And I won't go into like a lot of depth here, but I think this is like really the fundamental piece of what we're trying to achieve, and why I think, it's going to be so important for us to kind of like think carefully about the narratives that we're putting forward, and basically how even across narratives we like are able to build systems that allow us to work together. And in that sense, it's kind of like, Ethereum, this is the other sort of techno-optimist angle of this, is our alternative to doomerism. We sort of have this pervasive notion and broader society, at Web3, I think to some extent, maybe in the last few months as well, where we think, oh, like, everything's going to fail. It's like we're doomed to the systems that we've created for ourselves, and to like the problems we face as people. I think that's fundamentally misguided. And I think that it kind of fails to recognize what we've already achieved with sort of Ethereum as a technology, in the ways that we've taken agency and ownership back over sort of existing institutions. Still other fights to come, obviously, with, for example, the Tornado Cash situation that emerged, and many others in that sort of vein. But we can sort of also, use these coordination tools to fight for those causes and to fight for other causes we believe in. We can mint our own cooperative currencies in order to kind of work within the constraints we have and find capital needed to fund those efforts. And then we can design incentive mechanisms to keep people working on those things long term. And I think this is very much the heart of coordination. All these things is what we sort of mean by coordination at scale. But it's also fundamentally what makes this whole enterprise like techno-optimist. And I think it's sort of this sense that, we are together in a sort of bottoms up collective way, not top down collective or bottoms up individual way, going to take back agency and sort of control over the systems that we have kind of like let run loose in the world. And so, okay, like the whole point of this talk is public goods. Why is Ethereum a public good? What do we mean when we talk about public goods? What are we actually talking about? So a lot of the narratives before are kind of around the idea that we have sort of a lot of confusion about what it is that we're trying to achieve at the narrative level. We have a lot of sort of progress that we made in terms of like tangible ways to improve coordination. Techno-optimism helps us kind of like promote that as like a very good thing to do in an agentic sort of like person-to-person way. And in turn, we actually now have these like funding mechanisms and so forth that we can use, which I'll get to. And we've with Gitcoin tried to do this as a core part of our mission. But what are these things that we're actually funding? And when we're funding things in Ethereum and funding this coordination tool, why is that a public good? So traditionally, the notion of public goods comes back to this sort of Paul Samuelson 1954 sort of paper around non-excludability, non-rivalry. Things that are public goods are things that can't be excluded. No one can be excluded from them, or they're non-rivalrous. One person's access to this good does not restrict another person's access. And one of the interesting things about that framing is that it kind of was born out of almost the sort of idea that these public goods of sorts were sort of aspirational. They were sort of pipe dreams. And if they could be funded, they could be funded in mostly a top-down collective fashion by traditional states or state actors. And I think the major kind of problem with that is being that like it didn't allow us to think big enough about what we actually wanted to achieve. And it kind of was partly, I think, how we ended up with institutions that ran amok in ways that we didn't necessarily, intend them to do. And so, there's a lot of nuance to the way that we reframe public goods, but I think one very simple frame is the things that we want to see in the world are things that produce positive externalities for a broader group than the initial people involved in the process of maintaining that good. And the traditional example of this, like an electrical grid in like a city, transportation network, they have lots of really interesting kind of positive externalities that we can think about. So one, in the transportation case, property value goes up every time a new subway station is created in, say, New York City. There's lots of people that want to like kind of go towards that. And there's now an externality for other people around that specific local area. Same with electrical grids. If you have an electrical grid, you have like people that can now be part of the community, be part of the city. And that's very good for everyone. The probably less like local example, which we've started to see really emerge in conversation in Web3 with learning communities, is the notion of like a university. And that's sort of where I think things like kernel or things like emerging sort of like groups like Forefront or like MetaLabel and so forth are really starting to explore some interesting territory with the work that they're doing. Seed Club. There's a lot of communities like clubs that are basically technically private. Like technically you can't just go and learn at the university, but clearly, and they cost money to be part of. You can't just access it with zero capital through, but like you can actually still produce massive social gains via these institutions. And of course, that's why in the traditional world, like universities are funded by the state, funded as a public good in that sense. But I think what we're sort of forgetting in this way of thinking about so right now we've kind of created like, you've got like electrical grids, transportation, universities. These are all things that are fundamentally, like from most people's conception, public goods, despite this kind of dissonance around, well, wait, I have to pay for this. What are we like? How are we really considering that non-excludable, non-rivalrous? And you can see how that might create issues in the definition. But there's more interesting examples that I think start to create even more confusion for us than those. And I think open source software is sort of like one of these where I think there's certain things like, say, the library that we all use to build Web3 applications, something like Ethers.js, and something like Uniswap, which I think recoil at the idea of as a public good. And I think that's because there's this distinction between the token holder and the broader community. And we sort of have this notion that there's an in-group and an out-group. And if you're not in the token holder community, you're suddenly, at odds with the rest of the community, or they're at odds with you. And I think fundamentally, this is where the notion of positive externalities becomes very useful. The greater the network grows, the more not only the token holders benefit, but anyone who just happens to use in day-to-day interaction the protocol itself also benefits. And so in this sense, there's a little bit of a difference between the sort of traditional way of thinking about public goods and the way that Ethereum kind of redefines those to be about these positive externalities, especially in the face of existing fees, possible restrictions to use, and especially in the face of like different classes of members, people that are or are not token holders, people that are or are not delegates, people that are or are not core team members. And I think this is something that is still fundamentally important for us to wrestle with and explore as we think about what we're building on Ethereum and we're thinking about Ethereum making impact. We need to be thinking about basically, what is that boundary point that we think is acceptable? And I guess my case here today is that we're actually, a lot of these things that we are debating about sometimes, on twitter.com or whatever it might be, as being, oh, they're not really public, they're not really, they don't meet this criteria, they don't meet this like strict definition. I would argue that in many cases, those are things that we fundamentally all benefit from in a way that approximates something that we would like to call a public good, even if it's not the traditional way that we define it. And so in that sense, I think funding more of those things, I think building more of those things, I think finding ways to help people understand and educate people about more of those things is itself a public good. And it is something that actually is fundamentally in line with the sort of agentic techno-optimist vision that I think we all want to start to push forward, as sort of Ethereans in this network. And so fundamentally, we have a few examples of this that I think we're all sort of familiar with, but that I think are worth looking at, that we should be supporting in some form or another. Admittedly, I may be biased towards some of these. I think that, portable, especially private identity, like ENS with something like Seismo, which allows for that sort of privacy. I think that sort of form of identity is a really cool, like an important primitive for us to be able to, for example, solve civil resistance, ensure that we have some pseudonymous identities that we can all sort of interact with each other through, so that we can kind of move beyond this amorphous sort of like dark forest into something that's a little bit more visible, while still giving people the option to keep privacy, especially when they are at risk of, serious retaliation from, for example, state actors. I think this is where Solarpunk ultimately kind of like in the extreme gets it wrong, which is that like, yes, we want techno-optimism, but we need techno-optimism in a way that allows for people to consider privacy good and to consider privacy as a fundamental human right. And that's like, I think just a really cool application that obviously ENS has done an amazing job with, and many others are starting to really explore deeply. And I think there's a reason it's being like a really important topic for Ethereum, just because I think, haven't had this sort of portable layer for our own like lives on the internet, despite the fact that we use the internet probably more than once a day. I think it'd be very unlikely to find a lot of people who use it exactly once or less than once a day. I think that like there's a lot of these examples and I could go through them for a long time, but I also recognize that I have a limited amount of time. So I'll kind of just go through these pretty quickly for the remainder. But basically we've got decentralized storage. The DWeb principles are kind of like part of what Filecoin and IPFS have contributed to in terms of how are we thinking about creating systems that really prioritize user agency and decentralization and so forth. In general, I just think having decentralized storage kind of fits in with this need that we're talking about to have fundamentally like distributed kind of global coordination systems. And I think that the more centralized you get, the more you run this risk of basically capture the network in a way that isn't shared with the users, shared with the broader community. And I think that's one of the reasons this sort of positive externalities framing for public goods works in Web3 much better than it did in previous iterations, which is that like for each of these actually, but especially for like these kind of core identity storage primitives, having the infrastructure that you're building be shared, even if not everyone is owning that, like a portion of that infrastructure, equally as in a co-op, for example, I think it's very important for the long-term sort of like sustainability of Web3 for Ethereum, and is like kind of the core, part of what we're building here. The other two kind of components I think are a little bit higher up the stack. It's basically things like optimisms, retroactive public goods funding, quadratic funding, those are ways to help us in a grassroots way signal and basically fund things that we care about. I think this is really important because traditionally, again, like what is the reason that this sort of like state funding as like the only mechanism for public goods became so prominent? Well, because it's very easy to kind of like collect and like aggregate value and then kind of put that out into the world in a sustainable way if you're a government. But it's very hard to do that at a grassroots level, and especially hard to do it in a way where you feel like your voice is being heard. So having some ability for people to locally sort of signal what they care about, and then to be able to aggregate those things into a kind of preference map is really important. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a second. And then modular governance tooling, which I think is just very important for any of these structures, these DAOs, these tools that like basically are allowing for kind of the creation of public goods on Ethereum. This modular tooling is important for that to take shape. So basically, the thing that I'm focused on a lot day to day is things like this idea of collective sort of intelligence, collective decision making via things like quadratic funding. What quadratic funding basically means, I think everyone kind of knows at this point, is just that you're trying to essentially fund a large group of projects in a given area based on local individual preferences. And then basically philanthropic funds are matched according to that preference map. And the reason this is important is, again, in the state case, you don't really have the ability to really have a lot of say. There's not really actually, despite kind of a lot of academic conversations on this, a lot of participatory budgeting that happens in practice. But this is kind of a Web3 form of that participatory budgeting where we can actually take the action that we want to see in the world and know that it will be listened to by a broader group of philanthropists or folks that are helping to fund the ecosystem at large. And I think this is a really important kind of like example of what will be a much broader design space around the coordination of funding in the future. And I think that, like, again, there's this really interesting conversation about like, to what degree do we kind of rely on like collective intelligence? To what degree do we rely on experts? To what degree do we rely on like AI as the ultimate expert, as like this like kind of meta expert? And I think there's a real conversation to be had about like how much should we let go of our own sort of like capacity for decision making. And there's trade-offs there, of course. Like certainly experts are better for some decisions than others. But I think it's really, that's like a fundamental question that we're going to have to grapple with. And I think Ethereum is like a really great kind of showing point for having conversations around those tools in context. So in the end, I hope that by creating all these kinds of DAOs, by creating all these sort of like different ecosystems that are, creating their own local impact, creating positive externalities in the process, we're able to basically create a kind of impact network. And David Ehrlichman has talked a lot about this. He wrote a book on it called Impact Networks, I believe. And it's a very interesting idea in the sense that I think there wasn't really, the cypherpunks had this notion of we're all going to independently build our own tooling, work independently and solve for, we're going to fight the state through our own like kind of heroic action. I think the solar punks have the notion that we can do this like collectively and work with the state and be kind of like, a happy family. I think the lunar punks are kind of like trying to be more realistic about those things. But I think regardless of those different narratives, the idea that we can actually form impact networks locally together with some kind of broader, end coordination that's achieved, again, like as a result, I think that's ultimately where a lot of this is going, and where the benefit of Ethereum, the impact of Ethereum comes in. So hopefully that kind of got most of the points across here. I think I'm out of time. So all I'll say is Ethereum, I think, is a public good. I think the notion of public goods needs to evolve from where it is today. And I think that if we find ways to evolve that definition, we can coordinate towards a more techno-optimist future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was awesome. Maybe a quick question, just before you go. Like, if anybody wants to start like actively participating in, being a part of this kind of public goods movement using Ethereum, like, where's a good place for them to start doing that right now?
I'm definitely biased towards Gitcoin as a place to do it. I think going to the Gitcoin Discord and just getting involved. Optimism as well is just starting up, and they have lots of initial grants. I think honestly, at this point there's no real shortage of places to make an impact, and I think it's a question just of what kind of impact do you want to make. Find the thing. This is like everyone gives this advice, but like find the thing that you're passionate about, right? And leverage that passion and find ways to basically work with a group that needs that skill set. And kind of a lot of the original challenges of this with DAOs was you kind of tried to do that, and I think there wasn't really a good process for onboarding and getting people involved. But I think that as people have started to realize, hey, you need structure, leadership in DAOs, I think that's started to change. And so I think that people going to DAOs now, certainly relative to like a year ago, will have like a better experience kind of like finding the path in, finding the way to get involved. And I would say like, any of those organizations I mentioned are really good starting points. ENS as well, Filecoin, Protocol Labs as well is doing really good work in this area. Feel free to reach out if you have questions about orgs to get involved in, and I'm sure I can find one.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. Really great having you here, Scott. And congratulations also on, you're chatting about coordination and how hard that is. Almost 40,000 people donating in the last Gitcoin round that just closed yesterday. That's like a crazy amount of people. So congrats on the success on Gitcoin round 15.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Scott. And we're going to kind of chat about our next upcoming talks here. So thanks again, Scott, for Ethereum as a public good. Scott also mentioned a lot about how, privacy is a critical and important part of this whole infrastructure layer. So, really excited to have Bruno. Didn't even mean to have this back to back, but it's possibly a perfect segue to have Bruno come here and chat about both the work that Aztec is doing in this domain and just in general, the kind of crypto privacy landscape that Ethereum's been able to impact over the last couple of years. So Bruno, when you're ready, feel free to share your video, share your audio. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And whenever you're ready, happy to turn it over to you.
Yeah, let's do it. Cool. Can you see that?
Yep, that looks good.
Cool. Hey, everyone. My name is Bruno Walensky, and I'm here to talk about Ethereum and the crypto privacy landscape. So real quickly, the agenda I'll run through. One is a little bit about me and Aztec, the project I work for. I'll talk briefly about some of the other privacy solutions being built in crypto today. I'll briefly touch on zero knowledge generally and how Ethereum makes privacy possible today. And I'll also take a second to talk through some of the logical fallacies that usually come up in conversations about privacy that I think are important to address. So first, about me, a lot of what I'm going to be saying today is oversimplified for the sake of brevity. Of course, none of it is financial advice. I encourage everyone to do their own research. And I also encourage everyone to reach out. If they have any questions, I'm always happy to talk offline. So about me, I run ecosystem partnerships for Aztec. That means I lead the Aztec's grants program. We are launching version 2 of the Aztec's grant program soon. If private DeFi is something you want to work on, or you're really just passionate about privacy and want to discuss it, just reach out and let's find a project for you to be working on in the space. About Aztec, Aztec is what I like to call a ZK rollup. I like to say one of those ZKs is for scaling Ethereum and increasing the throughput of transactions that can settle on Ethereum. The other ZK is for privacy. The way it works is that we batch transactions on a rollup. We interact with L1 DeFi protocols via Solidity interfaces. What that means is that there's no need for L1 DeFi protocols like Uniswap or Aave or Curve or Lido or Element. There's no need to redeploy your L1 contracts. There's no need to fragment your liquidity across a variety of ecosystems. You can just, users that come onto the Aztec network can interact with your L1 DeFi contracts privately. without needing you to fragment your liquidity, which is a real benefit. We expose a software development kit for people to build private dApps on Aztec. And we've also built our own consumer front end called zk.money as a working example. So today, if you go on ZK Money, you can buy Lido staked ETH, you can interact with Element Finance, you can interact with the L1 DeFi protocols you know and love privately via Aztec. So I encourage you to go check out zk.money and see what it's all about. In terms of the other privacy solutions in the space, I think it's important to highlight a non-exhaustive list of them. There are so many cool projects being built in the space. There's so much awesome research and development being done in the space. I think people sometimes ignore the fact that the cryptographers, the researchers, the operators, the people working at Aztec and these companies are pushing forward not only the crypto system, but also mathematics, cryptography, theoretical computer science. They're doing really incredible cutting edge research across a variety of spaces. And here's like a very non-exhaustive list of some of the other projects in the space. But I think it's important to talk through more than specifics about each of our projects, a little bit about like the general features that you see today in crypto privacy projects. So big caveat, I'm going to caveat the whole presentation. Again, brevity, leaving stuff out, trying to make it quick and dirty. All these projects are multidimensional. A lot of them have different use cases, different user bases they are trying to appeal to, different leaders, different perspectives. Here are a couple of the features that I tend to see in crypto privacy projects. One, cryptography being used as a solution for scaling and privacy. Many of the privacy solutions are building an alt L1. Many are interacting with Ethereum L1 directly. Really, it's not only privacy that people are trying to solve, but also privacy at the same time as solving scaling and throughput of Ethereum generally. Many of these projects have some form of shielded transactions where users can selectively disclose information. They can selectively share the information that they choose to share. They are private by default, but there is some form of shielding or unshielding that is in the user's hands. All of this is secured by cutting edge cryptography and mathematics. There's ecosystems of dApps being built on a lot of these private projects for additional user functionality, like DeFi, payments. There are projects on Aztec building private multi-sigs for DAOs. There's really, it's a lot broader than just privacy with payments. There are private payments, but there's also private DeFi and a whole slew of various privacy-focused ecosystems of decentralized applications. And finally, a lot of these projects either expose a software development kit and or an in-house built programming language that allows developers to build in programmable privacy to their decentralized applications. Yeah, and so really the summary here is these projects are incredibly multidimensional, but these are some of the features that I tend to see in a lot of these projects. Really quickly, I want to talk about the zero knowledge stuff that underpins these whole systems. People a lot smarter than me are working on the math and cryptography that are underpinning these systems. And there is a ton of resources and explainers and 101s on the internet for learning more about zero knowledge. I'm going to keep it really high level. I do recommend either the Zero Knowledge podcast or A16Z's crypto research series, or really there's just an absolute plethora of resources out there to learn more about zero knowledge. I encourage you to go do that or to reach out to me, and I'm happy to point you in their direction to dive deeper. But for my 101 high-level overview, the cryptography that underpins these systems, most of it is via this primitive called a zero-knowledge snark. Snark stands for succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge, but really the point of them is that you can prove the validity of some statement without exposing any of the inputs that go to that statement. So I like to give one example, which is I want to go out to a bar, and there's three main parts of this interaction of me entering a bar. One, I need to prove that I am 21 plus, I can drink alcohol legally in the United States, etc. Two, I don't want to expose my name, my birthday, my address, my picture. I really don't want to expose anything about myself except for the fact that I am 21 plus and can enter the bar. On the other side, there's a security guard whose job, or bartender or whatever at the bar, whose entire job is verifying that I am of legal drinking age to enter that bar and drink. This seems kind of like a dumb example, trivial, like why would we be optimizing for something like me entering a bar? And I understand that. But what I'm trying to explain via this example is zero knowledge snarks give us the possibility of me proving that I am 21 plus and can drink legally without exposing any private information for me. And that's a good mental model to apply to a variety of different interactions that happen on Ethereum today or may happen in our lives in the future. And we're working on building out these primitives so that they can be used for trivial stuff like going to a bar. I think a mental model that the speaker before me, Scott, touched on briefly is there's a dark forest of bad actors out in the wild of Ethereum. And right now, our two options are basically expose information to a centralized intermediary, like a trusted centralized intermediary, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the space that we're building. Or two, just putting your information out in the wild for any of these bad actors in the dark forest to come grab, abuse, take advantage of, find a way to steal your information or take advantage of the fact that your information is non-private. By using zero knowledge snarks and some of the other cryptography and advanced mathematics being built in this space, we can remove the need to trust a centralized intermediary or not trust anyone at all. What we can do is trust math or trust Ethereum and trust Ethereum instead. So we can, if there's questions on zero knowledge stuff, we can talk a little bit more about it after, but this is like a general framework to think about this as. So how does Ethereum itself actually make privacy possible today? These rollups, at least in Aztec's case specifically, you generate these proofs that I am 21 plus without exposing any of my information, but you need to post your proof somewhere. You need a trusted layer to post these proofs onto. And the ideal situation is that you can post these proofs somewhere where no single institution can restrict my posting of these proofs. Two, anyone without my permission or without any intermediaries dictating who can and cannot view the proofs that have been posted. And we want these proofs to be there indefinitely so that you can use those proofs to reconstruct the state of the rollup, the transactions that you're doing on Aztec. Ethereum as the trustless global settlement layer, that is the place where rollups can post their proofs today because Ethereum satisfies like some of these qualities that are desirable for constructing like proof systems. So specifically, Ethereum is censorship resistant. Excuse me. You can be confident that the Ethereum base layer, the validators in our proof of stake model or the miners in the proof of work model won't censor blocks that contain proofs. And so that makes it a great place for us to trustlessly batch and post our proofs. There's also finality. So the Ethereum base layer processes the proofs from these zero knowledge rollups. Once those transactions are confirmed and finalized on the Ethereum layer one, those aren't reversible, even if you are a malicious rollup operator. And three is data availability. Posting proofs to Ethereum is permissionless, and you are able to check those permissionlessly, which lets you independently verify the state of the Aztec rollup or generally rollups. I actually saw this like an hour ago. Yeah, from 12 p.m. earlier today is Tim Bako, one of the lead coordinators of the incredibly complex and awesome move to proof of stake. Tim says that the number one problem he'd love to see someone come up with a solution to on Ethereum is private ETH transfers by default. Now, not to speak for Tim, but I think what he's trying to say here is that the base layer Ethereum have private ETH transfers by default on L1. But Aztec is a stepping stone to this. You can do private ETH transfers on Aztec via ZK Money today, right now, if you want to, while I'm doing this talk. So feel free to go check out ZK Money and see how this works. But just to demonstrate how important it is for privacy to be the default on Ethereum rather than like a secondary option that users need to opt into. When I'm talking about privacy in the space, there are a variety of logical fallacies that come up in these conversations. And so I think it's really important to address logical fallacies up front. And Twitter, just 280 characters don't give you enough space to do it. So I thought it was valuable to talk through them right now, especially with the sanctions to Tornado Cash recently by the United States OFAC. one thing I hear is that every privacy project is just a mixer. Now, on one end, the complexity of privacy projects today is still very high. And so I understand that not everyone can put in the time to understanding the nuances and the differences between our systems. But hopefully I've been able to demonstrate that, privacy projects are doing a wide array of different things. There's a lot of projects tackling privacy differently. A lot of them are building open source tools, Aztec included, open source tools for decentralized programmable privacy. So I think it's a little bit reductive to refer to every privacy project as just a mixer when there's a clear delineation between like a bunch of our privacy projects generally, and it seems like a logical fallacy to bunch us all into one classification. Secondary is I hear this a lot is the technology is interesting, but bad actors that might abuse technology make adoption or even research and development in this sector a non-starter on day one. The reason this is a fallacy is, you merely have to look at basically all technological development that's happened over the last 4 or 5 decades, or really since, all technological advancement that's ever happened in humanity. And you notice how bad actors potentially abusing a system has never stopped us from developing technology that could be net beneficial to the world, to Ethereum, to humanity. You can imagine artificial intelligence, which is a debate that's coming up more and more frequently. Artificial intelligence or gene editing via CRISPR or social media. A lot of these technologies could be abused by bad actors, but that doesn't make the research and development and really the community building and commercialization of these softwares, it doesn't make them a non-starter. It never has. And so it's a logical fallacy to follow that argument as, because a bad actor can use it, that makes adoption a non-starter. Frankly, I think this is a little bit of a cop-out. Bad actors use our traditional financial system. Bad actors use basically every software tool that's ever been created. Just because a bad actor may use it does not mean that the technology itself is for bad actors or built by bad actors. And frankly, it's a fallacy that is far too common in crypto specifically, but the world generally. And I think it's important to face that fallacy head on and really, call people out when they're abusing that argument. And finally, the third logical fallacy I see really frequently is you don't need privacy if you have nothing to hide. That statement just doesn't follow, right? Like, you may not need privacy if you don't need privacy if you have nothing to hide. That nothing to hide just doesn't really relate to your desire for privacy. As my colleague John Woo loves to say, if you don't care about privacy, like, why do you shower with a curtain on? We all want and value and respect our privacy to differing degrees, but to conflate the desire for privacy to criminal activity, i.e. nothing to hide, is just frankly absurd and unfair to a lot of people that want privacy for a variety of reasons. I mean, you could be a political dissident in a country like Ukraine that wants privacy for their safety and for their family's safety, or you might just not want your family members, colleagues, coworkers to see what you're spending your money on the weekends. And frankly, the argument that if you have nothing to hide, you don't need privacy is completely a non sequitur, illogical, and should be called out when it's used. So in summary, I believe privacy is a human right. And until the last few decades, all monetary transactions were private by default. Cash is private by default. And until the last couple of decades, we haven't really needed privacy in a financial perspective because it hasn't been an issue. In the last 2 or 3 decades, our technological advancement has been so rapid and so incredible that we've let a couple of big topics fall to the wayside. Number one is like our personal privacy, and number two is like our informational privacy, our data privacy, specifically in the context of social media. And so this is our opportunity to like rebuild these systems with privacy as the default. Second, I just want to highlight there's a broad, diverse ecosystem of projects that are doing critical research and development in a variety of fields outside of Ethereum or blockchain specifically, like mathematics and cryptography and theoretical computer science. And a lot of them are just exposing programmable privacy tools for others to build using our open source software. We at Aztec believe that building privacy solutions, building privacy solutions on top of Ethereum makes the most sense because of Ethereum's credible neutrality, Ethereum censorship resistance, and Ethereum's immutability. And there's a lot of logical fallacies that try to muddy the water around privacy tech. And I think it's important to call them out when you see them. And I think in our space, we may be noticing in the last month and a half, we need to be united around a cause like privacy. We need the entire space to demand privacy, to demand the right to determining your own level of comfort around your privacy, and really pushing for that across the space. On that note, I want to leave everyone with a quote from Phil Zimmermann, the creator of PGP, a very widely used encryption software that we all use today, whether you know it or not, in email or a variety of other places. Phil said, oh, sorry about that. Phil said, throughout the 1990s, I figured that if we wanted to resist this unsettling trend in the government of outlawing cryptography, one measure we can apply is to use cryptography as much as we can now while it is still legal. When the use of strong cryptography becomes popular, it's harder for the government to criminalize it. Therefore, using PGP is good for preserving democracy. If privacy is outlawed, then only outlaws can have privacy. And I just want to tweak that quote a little bit. PGP has been great for preserving democracy, but we've got a next wave of privacy solutions that are here to help preserve democracy and preserve personal freedoms. So therefore, using Aztec and other privacy solutions out there today is good for preserving democracy. If privacy is outlawed, only outlaws will have privacy. And I think that's the message I want to leave this on. So thank you all for your time. I can't even see how much time I've taken, so I hope I haven't run late or run short, but I'm happy to answer any questions from the audience, from Jacob. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruno. And yeah, what a great quote to wrap that up on. Yeah, I mean, we still have a little bit of time, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll relay them over to Bruno here. But maybe just to like kind of kick off a little bit of a conversation, like, we kind of touching on this at the end of your presentation, like it does seem that maybe a little bit weirdly, like privacy is very political in a lot of ways. And I think also like, you can almost see that like in your presentation when you're saying you're like caveats, like, not financial, like, you're kind of prepped for this already in a way, because I think you've probably been spending so much time in the space. Like you, just from like a developer perspective, I can definitely see that as being maybe a bit of a turnoff for some people. And I'm kind of curious, like what your thoughts are about for people who are, thinking about maybe building in the space or are very curious about kind of privacy, like, what either should they read, what should they kind of pull their inspiration for being in the space from, like, really just kind of highlight anything that comes to mind as as being like why this is like an important space to work in, even if maybe there's a little bit of a political kind of action happening in that space.
Yeah. I think everyone should look up the quote that I just ended with. If privacy is outlawed, then only outlaws will have privacy. Phil Zimmermann's, I guess I don't know if he goes by Philip Zimmermann's paper on this is phenomenal. It's just an incredibly concise, succinct write-up on why privacy is important. And he wrote this in the, I guess I don't know the exact date, but early 2000s, far before this has been a discussion in recent months. And it's incredible to see how that is applicable today. I think a lot of people in crypto, or I guess building technology in general, I can't speak for everyone, but we may not, me, for example, have not been old enough to even understand what was happening in the 90s when the discussion about weaponizing encryption tools was important. And I think it's important to get that historical context. I think the argument about crypto in general, about decentralization, about credible neutrality, about a global settlement layer outside of one that's maintained by federal governments or world governments as a unit, it's become politicized because everything has become politicized. But I think myself, Aztec, I would imagine all the privacy solutions in the space would feel similar. We don't do this because we have a political ideology. We believe that it's a human right to have your own privacy and make your own decisions about what you spend your funds on, where your money is deployed, without exposing that to the broad, not only to your inner circle, but to the broad world of bad actors that are out there. And so we're just trying to build solutions where consumers can make their own choices about where they want to sit on that spectrum of privacy. And so I would encourage everyone to try and get out of like a political lens when thinking about this, and just think about like your fundamental human rights, what you believe in, how you want to live your life, and whether privacy is a part of that. And I imagine that almost everyone cares about privacy to some regard. And so just think about where you sit on that scale, and two, try to understand your neighbor or someone you don't know when they say that they sit in a separate part of that scale. They're not bad people for wanting more privacy. That's just their preference of sitting on a different part of the scale. So one, read Phil Zimmerman's work on this. Two, feel free to reach out after and I can send you some more resources. And three, just try and view the situation non-politically and with empathy. And I think we'll understand that everyone here is just trying to advance humanity and really defend our personal liberties as everything gets more digitized and those liberties start to erode. I think that's all we're here for is to fight for personal liberties.
Amazing. I'll definitely take a look at Phil Zimmerman's post after this. And then, I mean, you actually brought up like what I was going to ask about as well. I also saw Tim's post earlier today on Twitter about, you know, sort of like Ethereum L1 transfers being, you know, private by default. As you mentioned in your talk, like this is the case for Aztec right now. And Tim at the end, like of his statement said, you know, it could completely change what the end state of the space looks like. I read that and I was like, huh, like what could that mean? And I haven't like had enough time to think about that yet. Given that you've been thinking about the space and Aztec already has this as an outcome, like what do you think, like what could be some of those kind of like end state outcomes that he's sort of hinting at here?
Yeah, and to clarify, again, I think what Tim is saying is that privacy at the base layer on the L1 protocol, which is not what Aztec is, right? We're an L2 rollup, but you have that functionality of being able to interact on L1 privately, send transfers privately to other addresses on L1 today. What is the use case that, for me at least, the biggest use case for crypto, like the end goal, end state use case here, is payments, right? Like we use payments. We don't get 2.5% taken away from the credit card cartels out there, and we transact trustlessly and permissionlessly privately. Now, if you want to do anything, any sort of payment where you may not want everyone to see what you are paying, you just can't do that on L1 today, right? Like I am brunny.eth. You can just go look at my address and you will be able to see all the things I've paid into. And unfortunately, like that's just the status quo today. But you know, payments, I'll go on a short tangent here. Aztec was actually started several years ago with the premise of bringing corporate debt onto Ethereum layer 1.
That's right, yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not possible because corporations value their privacy. And so if we want to enter into these two sectors, like payments generally, and really widespread adoption in the financial markets, whether like DeFi or just like DeFi, payments, global settlement layer, exchanges, really anything that you can imagine financially crypto being used for, like it requires privacy on the parts of everyone outside of the current crypto ecosystem that is like okay with the public nature by default. So I think like if you want to look at it from a market sizing thing, like global payments market, global financial market, just take like a small percentage of that, and this is the biggest industry. This is like 10x what crypto is today, and it's impossible without privacy. And so I think hopefully that answered your question, Jacob, of like how important it is this, how transformational is this, how big is it, how big is privacy for achieving this like end state of Ethereum and like global adoption of Ethereum as our trusted settlement layer.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you nailed the head on. You hit the nail on the head. There we go. On that one, I mean, payments being such a big part of everything we do all the time, and you know, really not being able to really tap into being a large percentage of that as a protocol, as an ecosystem, if not for privacy, right? So you know, enabling that, you know, really absolutely critical. So
and just one last note, yeah. Like the point here. I'm sorry, I know I'm going a couple minutes over. You probably could be privately transacting on Ethereum L1 today. Like you could, you know, open up a fresh wallet. You could figure out a way to basically get privacy, but we don't need that for global adoption. We need completely easy adoption of privacy solutions on Ethereum for that to really reach the mainstream, right? Like people are not going to go in and play this wallet roulette of like hiding funds and like that's just not the way that we're going to reach global adoption. So we really need simple consumer interfaces for adoption of privacy on L1 Ethereum. And I think ZK.money is like a great step in that direction. I encourage everyone to check it out and just like fund a little bit of money into ZK Money, send a private payment, and see like how awesome it is to see that Etherscan transaction as like not Brunny.eth, but Aztec rollup contract. No one can see actually who is funding the other side of that. So I encourage you all to go to ZK Money and check that out.
Awesome. That website's just zk.money, right?
ZK.money, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here, Bruno, and for your chat. Really appreciated it. And yeah, dovetailed so nicely with Scott's chat earlier. So that was just perfect. So thank you so much for your time and for being a part of this with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, everyone.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much again, Bruno. And we're going to move on to our next chat here, which is going to be with Ben West from the Gitcoin team. Of course, this chat is going to be called Beyond the Merge, Blockchains Enabled Climate Solutions. I think everybody obviously should hopefully know in this chat that, in the last couple, I guess the last week, actually, it's only been a week, Ethereum has received a massive upgrade called the Merge, which has dramatically changed its kind of climate footprint. Obviously, we're all, really excited about that. And I think it bears repeating ad nauseum until people really kind of realize how amazingly impactful that moment was for Ethereum as a climate perspective. I think Ben's probably going to talk about more of it, so I'm not going to jump in all over it. But yeah, without further ado, maybe I'll invite Ben up to the stage here to unmute and share his camera and his screen. And yeah, welcome to the stream, Ben.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Hey,
Pleasure.
Jacob.
And yeah, maybe I'll just turn it over to you. I mean, we have I don't want to talk too much about probably stuff you're already going to talk about. So, but I'm super excited to have you here and excited to learn more about what you're going to chat about.
Well, thank you, sir. I definitely will talk about the Merge, and we'll also talk about blockchain-enabled climate solutions. So why don't I just go ahead and share my screen? So beyond the Merge, we have talked a fair amount as a community about the significance of this moment. I just want to start with this graphic from a piece that The Economist did about the Merge, which had the kind of bizarre title of Farewell to the Netherlands. But, I think this little chart that they integrated really tells the story of the reduction of energy consumption and related greenhouse gas emissions from that moment where the Merge happened. That line going straight down is not something you see very often. It's pretty significant. And the idea of Farewell to the Netherlands is basically saying, that the amount of energy being consumed by the Ethereum blockchain and by all of us using it, is dropped by 99.95%, or, the equivalent of something like the Netherlands or Sweden or Chile would be another sort of comparable example. Of course, there's a range of different estimates about what that energy consumption looks like. But sort of the high end or most conservative, I guess you could call it, estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 million tons a year, which would be the equivalent of the Netherlands or Chile or Sweden. So, really significant. And I think it's important that we kind of recognize the significance of that. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in a sec. But first, just for the sake of introducing sort of myself and kind of how I fit into this conversation, my name's Ben. As you heard, I work for Gitcoin. I've also been doing a little bit of research on behalf of the Ethereum Foundation around blockchain-enabled climate solutions. So I'm kind of wearing a couple of different hats here. But I'm going to focus a lot of the sort of use cases that I'm going to talk about today on projects that have actually come through the Gitcoin climate rounds in the last 4 rounds. And I know Scott was here earlier talking and probably talked a bit about Gitcoin, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what Gitcoin is. But for anybody who isn't familiar, you can definitely go check out gitcoin.co and you'll find lots of information there. For the last 4 rounds of our quarterly grants rounds, we've run a climate solutions round. We've now got over 250 projects in that round, which is just mind-boggling. We had 26 in the first round we ran. It's definitely the cutting edge of climate solutions projects. I've worked in the climate space for over 20 years, mostly in the environmental nonprofit side, but I've also done clean energy plans and public consultations at the city and provincial level in Canada. It's a space that I think is just really, really exciting. I haven't seen this many people this excited about anything to do with climate solutions in many years. It's become really a testing ground for new ideas. And actually a place where a lot of VCs and others kind of go to look at what has the interest in the sort of what harnesses the wisdom of the crowds to really sort of show that its value in this space. So I'll kind of walk you through a variety of different sort of use cases and approaches that are enabled by blockchain technology. And I think we're at a pretty interesting moment now where a lot of people are going to start paying attention to what's possible with blockchain technology, who may have hesitated or taken a small sort of step back. Just because of concerns around energy consumption as it related to sort of, using blockchain for climate solutions, perhaps, they won't be as concerned now. I also want to just recognize the contribution of our matching fund partners. It really is our partners who make it possible for Gitcoin grants rounds to be a reality. And we've had a lot of different really exciting partners come on board in the last little while. And it's really a mix of, Web3 projects, many of them graduates of Gitcoin funding, folks who got their start, inside of Gitcoin, and also, some folks who are kind of a step removed from Web3, but are sort of dipping a toe in the space, folks like Kimball Musk and Schmidt Futures, Eric Schmidt's foundation, and others who are starting to get actively involved. So really cool to see how this kind of mixture of partners from across the Web3 ecosystems, as well as, increasingly folks who have an interest in climate solutions more broadly, or in Web3 specifically, starting to get involved. So, really the first thing that we end up talking about when we talk about, these use cases is the idea of getting rid of middlemen, putting money directly in the hands of people. When I talk to people that are building on Web3 technology, on blockchains, it's really this kind of fundamental principle of blockchains that is the first thing that brings people to the table. It's this idea of reducing the need to sort of pay rent-seeking individuals in the middle of transactions, that just opens the door to a whole world of potential innovation. And I would say that is kind of the first piece, and then often we end up talking about composability and interoperability, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just as a starting point, one of the really beautiful things to see happen, has been kind of both on the side of helping when there's problems, and this has been the case for, funding going to folks in Pakistan with the Save Pakistan Crypto collective, but also, we've seen it in terms of, things like support for folks in the Ukraine, and of course, millions of dollars has gone directly to, both the government in the Ukraine, but also to a lot of different groups on the ground doing good work, and just being able to, put money directly in the hands of people where it's needed, is I would say kind of the starting point for this conversation, kind of beyond the merge. Now that we've seen this massive reduction in energy consumption, and by the way, I think it's worth pointing out that the merge is probably the biggest reduction in energy consumption from any industry in the modern era of human history. I tried to think of anything comparable in terms of sort of the amount of energy reduction, and had a hard time thinking of another example. Really, the closest thing would actually be the actions of countries, not the actions of industries or companies. That reduction in annual energy consumption is super significant. And, as Ethereum continues to grow, of course, that, the emissions would have continued to grow along with it. So, it's not only a reduction in potential energy consumption right now, but if we look at that, if Ethereum gets 10x or 100x in terms of the amount of use, the amount of value that's being derived, the associated emissions are not going to go up with it, which is really an admirable thing. And I want to just, for any ETH core devs who are out there listening, I just want to give my personal thank you for that contribution. It really is significant and historic. So both in terms of direct funding to projects where there's a problem that we're trying to solve, where we're like looking at climate adaptation, but also, on the mitigation side, just getting money directly in the hands of people trying to do good things, Like, for example, this group, Iowaka Uganda, who's been a grantee on the Gitcoin platform. They've said that, really without Gitcoin, it would have been very hard for them to do what they're doing. It's given them the ability to plant trees, install solar panels, in schools and health centers, all throughout, the area that they're doing their work. And this is just a couple of examples, but, it's kind of the first use case of what the implications of removing middlemen can look like on the ground. The next use case that I'm going to point to is one that I think is, really exciting, actually, and probably one of the lesser known and understood, and one of the areas where I think there may actually be the most opportunity or significant amounts of opportunity. So first of all, using the composability and interoperability of various different tools that are built in the sort of DeFi space has opened up this door to direct financing of solar energy projects or other clean energy projects. And I'm just highlighting a couple of them on the screen here who are grantees from the Gitcoin grants round. Projects like Village Grid or Zero Labs or Make Change Possible, all at different scales and different locations, are actually using these DeFi protocols, these kind of lending platforms, borrowing platforms, different forms of, decentralized financing so that people can directly contribute to funding solar projects on the ground. And in particular, I want to give a shout out to the Solar Foundation, which is a group that's trying to harness these mechanisms to directly fund projects actually for Iowaka, Uganda, as well as for people in Puerto Rico more recently, in basically an attempt to try to bring more resilience and the ability to, basically have your own microgrids at the local level, with the help of, these kind of funding mechanisms. And what they're doing also ties into the folks at Zero Labs who are using renewable energy credits as a way to go about doing this kind of work. This is kind of the equivalent of carbon offsets, but for renewable energy. So, where you can actually buy, credits for a certain amount of electricity consumption. And I think these are really interesting and sort of novel approaches to bringing more liquidity directly into these markets and to make these kinds of projects a reality. And it's worth pointing out that, that these are investments that can generate a stable return over a period of time, and it's really beautiful to see how that capital can sort of find a home and more efficiently just actually make these projects a reality on the ground. So some really interesting work happening in that regard. I also put up this group 7 Energy, which is a company in Norway, or I should say it's an organization in Norway that's using what I would call a sort of forward-thinking policy to facilitate community energy. Like they're actually using blockchain technology for decentralized grid management. And that's similar to what Village Grid does as well, to basically make it possible for people to buy and sell electricity directly from each other. I think that this is one of those things where the potential for it is exponential, but it also has barriers in the so-called meat space. So luckily in Norway, there's policies that really make it difficult for electricity providers, the folks that own the grid infrastructure. It makes it hard for them to limit the ability of communities to do this. And in some cases where people would like to see things like this happen, they run into obstacles with regulators. There are some examples, though, that are not at the community level even, but even just at the individual building level. In the process of the research I've been doing, I actually found a company based right here in Toronto, where I am, in the birthplace of Ethereum. Shout out to Toronto. Who have actually been using blockchain technology to facilitate microgrids at the condominium level. The charging infrastructure for electric vehicles usually is kind of a one-way process. You're pulling electricity off of that charger, you're paying a fee. But what is being made possible by this company in Toronto is that they're actually making it possible to actually sell your electricity back into the condominium complex. So, the electricity that you've got stored in your battery, for most people, their automobile isn't being used over 90% of the time. That can now become a backup battery. And if you imagine that at scale in a condo complex, imagine, the entire underground parking being filled with vehicles that have electric batteries in them. And I think increasingly in the years ahead, we're going to see more and more vehicles where that's the case, especially as people are seeing costs rise around the world for gas. It just becomes increasingly an opportunity for that parking garage to now become basically like a backup battery bank, and that can be useful in the case of blackouts. But it can also really help with moments of peak demand. In a lot of jurisdictions, when you are at kind of peak parts of the day, people are charged more for electricity because there's such a demand on the grid. And that can also result in using natural gas or coal-fired power plants that may not run all the time, but are sort of used as a backup source of electricity. Now, if you can sort of manage that more efficiently and actually draw power from batteries that are within a building, not only are you creating a new revenue stream for those automobile owners, but you're also potentially creating, the ability to reduce that sort of additional demand on the grid itself during those kind of peak moments. So, yeah, I think the financing of clean energy and the facilitating of decentralized grids is a totally fascinating and very rich, ripe opportunity for innovation. I think in some locations we're seeing kind of the equivalent of what happened in the global south when people just jumped right over landlines and went right to cell phones. I think we may see the same thing happen with these microgrids and distributed grids facilitated by blockchain technology, where we'll actually see solutions popping up that were financed perhaps by micro loans from a whole bunch of different people on the other side of the world, who are all getting a little bit of return from the money that's being generated by selling that electricity between neighbors. And also opportunities for, whether it be local farmers and business owners and others, who are renting out their rooftops or their land to facilitate these projects to generate some income that they may not have had otherwise. So really a win-win scenario, and something that just wouldn't be possible in the same sort of way with the same sort of transparency, clarity, and all the stuff that comes with the interoperability of all these various different DeFi protocols and tools plugging into this space. Probably the most commonly known use case for blockchain technology in the kind of climate space is around the tokenization of carbon and other ecological assets. Carbon offsetting is a very common approach taken by governments and companies to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. Basically, the hope is that companies will do everything that they can to reduce their emissions, or so will countries. But then if they're trying to reach a certain goal, often they'll buy offsets to help sort of fill the gap. And this is definitely the space where we see the biggest number of projects who are using blockchain technology, again, to bring additional liquidity, to sort of build on top of these various different DeFi protocols, and to create what people are calling the refi space, the regenerative finance space. That takes a lot of different shapes and sizes. I kind of showed a cross section of a bunch of different interesting and innovative projects. Senkin in the middle of the screen here has created a dashboard that is kind of a clearinghouse for all kinds of different offsets, that tells the stories of the projects, that helps to draw attention to the sort of different approaches that are being taken and the projects that are being directly financed. Of course, the beauty of doing these kinds of projects enabled by blockchain technology is that it just opens up a whole world of possibilities in terms of cutting out middlemen again. One of the biggest costs of doing carbon offsets is actually the validation and verification. And I'll talk about that in a second, but really even just at the surface level, knowing how much is being paid, knowing whether an offset has actually, occurred, all of that is stuff that's especially enabled by blockchain technology. And just because of the sort of ease of use of many of these protocols, brings a lot more liquidity into the space, which is really a big part of what's needed in the carbon offset space, is to just bring in more demand, which will then generate more and more of these projects actually occurring in the real world. So I also included a couple of other projects like Endangered Token or Neptune Chain, who are trying to look at other ecological assets like forest preservation or the sustainability of the marine environment. Regen Foundation and the Regen Network is a really interesting project, and really a set of projects being built on top of a protocol that I think is really worth checking out. Doing some very interesting stuff in terms of looking at ecological value, and also using their own standards to bring offsets directly on chain, as opposed to some other projects that are using pre-existing offsets and tokenizing them, which is basically can be very effective, but also has some limiting barriers when say a group decides to not allow that activity to take place, as is kind of the ongoing conversation right now with Vera, the biggest voluntary carbon offset market right now. Also just want to give a quick shout out to Return Protocol. Really cool project that just allows you to set and forget offsets directly in your wallet. So you can just basically set up a certain percentage of every transaction to go towards carbon offsets, and you can just make that happen very easily. And of course, as I think everybody is well aware, user experience is one of the most important things for us to be wrestling with in the years ahead. Cool to see projects that are just trying to make it as easy as possible. So I'm not going to mention all these projects. Spirals and Refi South also doing great stuff. But as I tend to do, I'm noticing I got a lot of slides and only not as much time as I could talk endlessly about this. So the next piece of this that I think really is important, and it connects to the conversation around asset or offsets, is the world of monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV. Tracking emissions, is definitely super important, and verifying impact is super important. And oracles have become a big part of conversation around blockchain technology in recent years. There's some great projects like Astral and Shamba who are trying to use oracles to help with the verification of offsets. So like if somebody makes a claim that they're protecting a piece of forest, how do you know? And part of the way you can do that is using satellite data. Weather data also becomes very important. And even in some cases, even putting monitoring devices directly in the soil or at a farm can bring that information on chain and be used as a sort of an additional layer in that stack of technology that can help actually verify the validity of emission reductions. And Shamba is already using this technology to help bring new revenue to farmers in various places in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa. Really exciting to see what they're doing. I also want to give a shout out to Blockchain for Climate Foundation. They're big fans of Ethereum. So, if you don't know them already, you should definitely check them out. They've been around for many years, run by a guy named Joseph, who I've known for many years in Vancouver. Super lovely guy. And, they have been trying to bring the Paris Agreement, the greenhouse gas reduction agreement, onto the Ethereum blockchain for many years, and meeting with a lot of politicians and others. But really at its core, I think it's important to understand that using blockchain to actually do the carbon accounting in a transparent way is fundamentally a very important and useful attribute of what blockchain can bring to the climate space. Already the government of Canada, British Columbia, and many other places in the world are experimenting with this. It's much needed. There's a real lack of standardization of how greenhouse gas accounting is done in terms of how the information is shared. There's a hodgepodge of databases and spreadsheets that are floating around out there in the world, and it's very hard to wrap your head around exactly what's being done in that space. So I'm actually very excited about that sort of overarching, like, how do we use blockchain technology just for the monitoring of greenhouse gases and climate impacts, as well as that sort of more on the ground monitoring of specific projects that are making claims, if we're going to pass our money to folks, having that sort of level of verification. In short, I think blockchain could actually basically solve some of the biggest problems with carbon offsets. Logistics and supply chain efficiency is probably the least sexy and potentially one of the most important uses of blockchain technology in terms of reducing energy. A tremendous amount of energy use goes into the movement of goods around the world. Already big companies like Maersk and others are using blockchains, in their case, I think private blockchains, But increasingly, we're seeing, how this can be super, super important in this space. And the graphic that I included here is from the folks at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who are doing some really interesting work in this regard. Also, a shout out should go to the folks from Filecoin Green, who are doing some very important work in this space as well, around sort of attestations and different ways of sort of monitoring impact. And folks who have had a lot of experience working directly in this space. So each one of these pieces I could spend an hour talking about, but let's just say that logistics and supply chain efficiency, super important, and another really exciting opportunity in the blockchain space to really have an impact. Finally, the last use case that I'm going to highlight is actually community arts and culture projects. Culture does not change all by itself, and this is one of the things that that we fund through Gitcoin grants rounds that I think is kind of underrated in its importance. On this page, there's a bunch of different interesting projects. One of them is a video game. One of them is a documentary. Reef Fi DAO, who has the cutest name in all of crypto. I always just call them Reef DAO because I get confused, but they're trying to protect the Great Barrier Reef by making a digital twin of the Great Barrier Reef in sort of a metaversal space where you can buy portions of the reef, and it'll finance researchers who are making 3D models of the Great Barrier Reef using some innovative new underwater cameras. And really, to be honest, it was the first time that I really got excited about the metaverse as much as I'm into games and whatever else. I hadn't really seen the implications of a metaversal space as part of climate solutions. ReFi DAO is doing some really interesting stuff. There's also a lot of different conferences and educational programs like Open Campus that are seeing funding coming in. Hibiscus DAO is a group that's looking at standardization for reducing energy consumption in the fashion industry using blockchain technology. That's their logo up in the top right corner. And some just amazing artists. For anybody who pays attention to Gitcoin, you've probably heard us talk about solar punk art. Definitely one of the coolest things that I see happening in the space is just kind of this visioning of how the world could be. And I think that, the more that we have that conversation, get people excited about the real world use cases that we talked about today, but then sort of imagine what it looks like in our day-to-day lives. I think that's what it's going to take to really start changing people's perception and understanding of the value of this kind of technology. So I just wanted to sort of end off with this idea of, just one last thing about Gitcoin, which is, people say, I've got a friend named Pranav from ReFi South who says people come to Gitcoin for the funding, but they stick around for the community. And, I think that really is the secret sauce of the Web3 space in general and Gitcoin in particular. The interoperability and composability of our tools really leads to this, collaborative space where people support each other. It's been very exciting to watch these projects over the last 4 grants rounds evolve and grow, and collaborate, learn in public. Sometimes things work, sometimes things don't, but we all, kind of take big steps in the right direction as the result of that kind of approach. So I just, I love seeing these kind of quotes from various different people in the community about the experiences that they had with Gitcoin. To me, it's really just amazing to sort of watch this evolve and grow. If you haven't checked out any of our Twitter spaces, we've done a bunch of these shill spaces for folks in the climate space, as well as just others on Gitcoin. And it's been really exciting to sort of see all these different projects come and share what they're working on, and often make new relationships in real time. And, sometimes people find co-founders, or they find developers, or they find funders, or they just learn about, something interesting that's going on somewhere else in the world. So that's definitely a very cool part of what you see happening day to day at Gitcoin. And I'll just leave it there and say, I would love to talk to anybody who is interested in what could be done in this space, or is curious to learn more about this space. I threw my Twitter handle and my Telegram up there. Feel free to come and, find me and talk more about, what is possible in the Web3 climate solution space. So thanks for the time to chat about all this stuff.
Thanks for being here, Ben. Really appreciate that. And I think awesome overview of just like all the different kind of things that are happening in the space and what's been made possible. I know we're a little bit over, but I kind of want to ask a couple of questions
Sure.
that are coming to mind. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as well. But yeah, I mean, now that we've kind of done this major improvement, as you mentioned, to kind of like, I guess, wipe the energy efficiency or the energy usage of the Netherlands off the map, and Ethereum's usage now is like, I think more representative of like the volume of what it should be. Like, given that all other climate solutions and things that are happening on chain exist, like, is there a way where we could like measure that impact in a way where maybe Ethereum could almost be like carbon, not even just carbon neutral, but also like carbon negative? Is there a way where we could kind of get to that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some things are easier to count than others, but definitely the offset protocols and the renewable energy credits, many of those projects actually have dashboards. A big shout out to the folks for ETH for Climate, which is kind of a new coalition that's just recently come together, that's actually talking about offsetting historic emissions from the Ethereum blockchain, which I think is a noble and worthwhile activity. For me, the bigger picture really is just like, how do we make Ethereum a massively positive contributor to climate solutions, regardless of just historic emissions, but also like kind of beyond the emissions calculations, and things like carbon accounting, for example. It's kind of hard to quantify what the impact of that is, just having better information in the hands of people more readily, or things like their arts and culture projects, again, sort of harder to quantify. But definitely there are a lot of ways that we can use blockchain technology to monitor, the impact of all of these projects. And I'll give a shout out to the folks at Zero Labs and to the folks at KlimaDAO, who both have some great dashboards already that they're experimenting with. And anybody who wants to take a look can go find the Discord for ETH for Climate, and you'll see a lot of that conversation happening there.
Amazing. And then maybe one last like really quick thing that comes to mind for me, like, you mentioned, historical Ethereum. I think it's like to your point about earlier in the presentation about how like you can't think of any like proxy or equivalent to like that much kind of energy usage being kind of like flipped off in a switch outside of maybe government policies and stuff like that. Like, it is a big change, and I think like there is a large kind of consensus almost that had formed during the proof of work days of Ethereum that like it is energy inefficient. It's part of the kind of battle against climate change, that like we need to go up against Ethereum, not work with it. I mean, you probably spend a lot of time, chatting with different people that maybe, aren't as, maybe kind of in the know as kind of the group of people that are probably watching this. But like, what have you seen as like a really good way to sort of reverse that narrative now that like we really truly have done that with technology? How do we now do that with kind of the more social aspect of it?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I think it's the storytelling around projects and use cases. That old saying, sell the sizzle, not the steak. I think because we're such like a developer heavy space and still quite early in the sort of building out of tools, I think there's kind of an emphasis on talking about the how everything works instead of the sort of why it's useful. And I think like for most people, really all they understand is kind of the payments or the sort of investment components of this. So my hope is that just by like telling these stories of these innovative projects and the really interesting things they're doing with this technology, and showing why that couldn't just be done, with a set of Excel spreadsheets or, some traditional database structure, or how that, the removal of middlemen, takes a bunch of rent-seeking activity out of the mix and puts more money directly in the hands of people. Or even things like the electric charging station in buildings in the city that I live in. To me, like you don't even need to know that there's blockchain under the hood there making that work. But maybe when you do learn that, then you'll have sort of a different view of this technology. I can tell you, I've talked to a lot of climate-oriented organizations and individuals, over the years. From working in the space for many years, but since I've been working at Gitcoin and even before as a person with an interest in crypto. And I've been telling a lot of people, like, let's just keep having this conversation after the merge, because like people have been a little bit reticent, but, sort of interested in what was possible. And I think there's going to be a big influx of people showing up who are sort of maybe now open to seeing what is possible in this space. And that's really exciting to me.
Amazing. Well, appreciate your time, Ben. I'm also a fellow Torontonian, funny enough, and I had no idea that those chargers in my condo building are connected to a blockchain. So maybe I'll message you after to try to figure out what's going on there. But it's yeah,
Sounds
it's
good.
really a pleasure to have you here, Ben, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun. Cheers.
Cheers. Okay, great. So kind of moving on to another topic that I think is, really, really interesting. It's been a topic that's been obviously in the news during over the last couple of years, as people are kind of adapting to new ways of working. Kind of in parallel to that, I think maybe, a little bit quieter has been this kind of innovation of kind of the future of work and people building and doing things in a permissionless fashion on Ethereum. So I wanted to invite Tina from the Station team to come and give a chat about kind of the work that's being done both at Station and just kind of broader in the ecosystem, and just sort of like kind of what is happening in the space and how Ethereum is impacting it. So Tina, without further ado, I'd love to kind of welcome you to the stage, and feel free to share your video, unmute, and yeah, it'd be awesome to go from here. There you go. Hey, Tina, good to have you here.
Great to see you.
Awesome. So yeah, feel free to share your screen if you have something to share, and I will get out of the way. And I'm excited to hear what you hear your presentation. We're excited about this.
Awesome. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Tina. I'm one of the co-founders of Station Labs, and we're building a set of decentralized tooling to help contributors and DAO members coordinate and collaborate with each other more permissionlessly. So this is a very, very broad topic, and I kind of put air quotes future of work because we all know that it's been kind of abused as kind of this buzzword, throwing around both in the VC sphere and also kind of in Ethereum, and kind of wanting to start off as like, what even is the future of work? And we see that definitions have evolved over time. Some people believe that the future of work is remote work, is distributed work. There's this idea about new models of value attribution and distribution around creator economy, around gig economy, and then we have this open source ecosystem that is super, super close to kind of Ethereum's foundation and ethos, and generally the larger crypto ecosystem as well. So I think that honestly, it's a combination of a lot of these concepts all in one. And I think a lot of times when we look at what's happening in Ethereum, what's happening with DAOs, what's happening with this new class of labor, sometimes it's very easy to kind of see things in silos where, these are, very groundbreaking things are happening in Ethereum, which, oftentimes are true, but also, the same movement is also happening beyond. So I think the goal of the talk is really kind of put things more contextually and really look at the current stack of kind of global distributed work and, the kind of existing infrastructure to support that, and kind of like envision and ideate like what the possibilities could be moving forward. So a big move, around the future of work is really this idea of, in the past we worked in offices and now we're working online. But also this idea of like relationships are now becoming much more digitally native, where we meet people on Twitter, we meet people on GitHub, we meet people on these digital platforms, and then we, because of the proof of work, that it's both a very crypto native concept, but also it's a concept that is prevalent in other digitally native platforms as well, like GitHub, where you have a provenance of the work that you've done. And because of these relationships, you see this kind of reflection of, the offline space being reflective of these online relationships that are also very authentically built based on, what you've done on the internet. And the reason why we're all here right now, at ETH Global is, because of this distributed network, Ethereum, and now people are gathering in real life and like offline, kind of discussing topics that, unite us. And really kind of one framework that I really like to think about is actually through the lens of urban design, because why we need cities. I really love this book called Order Without Design by Alain Bertrand. And he kind of talks about how cities are essentially labor markets. And one quote that, resonates with both myself and also a lot of other DAO leaders and, founders in this space are really kind of thinking about the Ethereum and also generally DAOs as a labor market, as a city. So what does a city need? So we have, a well-functioning labor market brings together people with varied but complementary knowledge and skills, the preconditions for innovation, and a well-functioning labor market also makes possible every other urban attraction, like orchestra, museums, and art galleries. So we're already seeing that, kind of the early glimpses of that in crypto and in Ethereum ecosystem. We have protocols like Yearn and Index Co-op that are, very, very well organized and like corporative DAOs with, a variety of different functions, the same way that we, in a company, we have all these different functions. But we also kind of see these urban attractions that start to emerge from that central economic activities of people producing valuable protocols, generating economic value for the Ethereum ecosystem, which, kind of subsequently increases the value and demand of Ethereum as a participant, just like how, the value of kind of the US or the value of New York is kind of increasing the demand of people wanting to migrate into that city and ecosystem. So, from urban attraction perspective, we see kind of ETHOB, which is, a great social DAO throwing events in real life in Idlewild, California, and which actually completely, I think, changes the town's perception of crypto. And now I am aware that recently they also received like a 13,000 donation to kind of spin up another like a more ongoing initiative on the local level to have kind of more crypto communities to gather and meet in real life and in Idlewild, which is kind of a crazy impact on the real world economy, if you think about it. And then there's, DAOs like Bright Moments, where they're hosting events, exhibitions, shows, inspired by their collections of NFTs. And really, like, their NFTs are great and they're beautiful, but it's very clear also that, beyond the art, it's much more beyond the artwork itself, where these artworks are just collections of identities where, people who have the same kind of artwork from the same city could find and discover one another and then go to these events and actually see each other in person. So if we look at Ethereum as this new city, then we already kind of saw this kind of early glimpse of, we have complementary skill sets and we have some cultural events that are happening. But as we know, like, it's still super, super early. And, many people are complaining about how the space is generally inaccessible for most people. And activities and economic kind of engine haven't really been started before we really can onboard majority of and more people into the space and benefiting from this ecosystem. Trying to go a little bit more philosophical and look at the dimensionality of work here, where, what is actually work and what does work consist of? And I would say that there's like a few dimensions that we want to kind of use as a framework to look at where we are, in the digital labor space and where we are for specifically Ethereum. So for work, we have, tasks, we have mobilization, which is a group of people completing tasks and doing things towards the same goal. And as you build this meaningful relationships with the people that you work with, you're developing this sense of belonging, this sense of identity. And, as you slowly, discover these places of belonging, you also, actualize and really find out kind of what you are called for. And these are the concepts that should be familiar with anybody who has studied either urban design or just design in general, to understand, these are the different, some like to use the framework like Maslow hierarchy of needs, and others just like to kind of say a little bit more abstract. But if we actually look at the intersections of a lot of these themes, we start to see different shapes of work that is happening both within crypto and outside of it. So, we see gig economy bounty boards as sitting in the intersection of, mobilizing task and gig workers. We see in the intersection between mobilization and belonging, as corporations and global corporation startups, distributed work. And also, of course, we're very familiar with DAOs. And in the intersection of belonging and actualization, we traditionally have this perception of nation states and churches, but right now we see the rise of maxis and whack me culture and, kind of belief systems and almost like close to kind of a religious type of state that is being formed by the formation of also token networks. And kind of on a spectrum, we see kind of on the left side being, labor that is much more mercenary, like all the way to labor that is much more missionary, that are driven to a shared purpose, a mission, and also like the value that's being created. And those values are much less monetary, but more so around, your sense of identity and self and what it kind of means to be a part of the network. And I think in terms of Ethereum, like this is a more realistic look at where we are right now. We have, traders, bounty hunters, airdrop farmers, one token, and Axie players kind of representing labor that's more on the opposite, like on the left side of the spectrum, which are tasks, more fungible tasks and labor. We have on the right side, we have, meaningful labor that's being produced, which is storytelling and actually creating movement around, being a Bitcoin maxi or Ethereum maxi, and LARPing, which is, an ultimate form of belief, which is, role playing as an anon developer or really kind of finding this new self on the internet. And then we have everything in between, which is kind of the real infrastructure to make this a viable path to between the tasks and skills that can be practiced in the Ethereum network, and also the meaning behind and the vision of decentralization and permissionless. And right now, the reason why I grayed out the two circles in between is like these are still being built and being constructed, and they're still super early in their formation. And what are they? They're the hackers, they're the product designers, they're the community stewards, funders, educators, meme perpetuators. They're the people that are actually like kind of starting to realize the lack of infrastructure in this space and how it's very, very difficult to actually sustain their living or actually have a full-time job just, strictly in this token network. And taking a step back to look at, how the global digital labor infrastructure kind of functions. And this is like super broad strokes, definitely a little bit reductionist, but really, right, like there's a few layers here. On the foundational layer and the base layer, we need local laws and compliances to ensure that, like if I'm a worker, I'm compliant of the local labor law. And also I'm getting paid in my own currency so that I can consume, local goods. And then kind of in the middle, there's this network that allow me to find work in the first place. And those are the toolings and marketplaces, for example, Upwork and recently Brain Trust that emerge as this, flattening of the global labor market, where, if we analyze like cities at labor market, we are now seeing that we don't really have to live in New York anymore to have access to a higher paid job. And that is the whole idea of, Stripe increasing the GDP of the internet as a payment rail. And I think a lot of the messages are also true here, where, with these marketplaces, now, if you are someone like anywhere in the world, you're able to find opportunities that otherwise you have not found in your local market. And in order to actually coordinate, people from different time zones, we're now seeing, productivity tools like GitHub, Notion, Telegram, emails, very standard boilerplate tools now, both in crypto and outside of it, being that coordination rail. But if we look at a decentralized digital labor infrastructure versus a centralized global digital labor infrastructure, what is different and what are the possibilities here, which I think is the most fun to think about. Like if now the topic is the future fork on Ethereum, is that right now, in absence of, local laws and compliances, in the absence of nation state as this enforcer and this forcing function of any type of viability and like legitimacy and enforceability of agreements made between individuals, like in absence of that, can smart contracts, can a lot of these crypto native primitives actually play the role of, providing that accountability and trustlessness between individual nodes and contributors in the network. And kind of looking being a little bit more practical here, I think there's generally two approach when it comes to constructing this base layer. The crypto rails, the payment rails, which is, I think, the most well understood, which is, embedded value distribution when you create some type of work. So that's, on a very practical level, that is like when you perform a task, when you, finish, a piece of work or a bounty, you immediately get paid in crypto. Or, when you farm, farm in a Polygon-based game, you get paid in that token immediately, that can be consumed later or be staked in another protocol. Like, these are very familiar, primitive for anybody who is here. But then I think the more interesting part is really about, like, how can we actually start to radically think about the compatibility of smart contract and IRL law. And the other thing that's very interesting, but very, very hard, is about the enforceability. Like, in absence of legal infrastructure, like, can we actually enforce some type of outcome and consequences when, agreements have been violated? And this is, like, I think the least talked about. There are a few groups like LexDAO and WorkDAO that have emerged that are kind of solving that problem. But really, I think we're still super early in that development of, like, finding the right kind of legal frameworks that both work on chain to create that record and trustless feature of law, but also being able to be backward compatibility so that it can still remain compliant for local laws if that's the desired outcome, which I believe it is for many crypto organizations, irregardless of their status around, like, anonymization and pseudonymity. And then the more interesting and exciting part really lies in this idea of identity. So, when you are a labor and you're a contributor on Ethereum, and, within this Web3 ecosystem, you have a wallet, what does that even mean as, now you have a identity that's completely different from the one that has been defined by traditional nation state and laws that have been constructed in the past. We no longer have a passport. We don't have an ID. So your ID really is kind of the activities that have been associated with the wallet. So there's some ideas here that I think this stack was made, like, in the past 48 hours. And really, it was like a quick, just very, very early thinking around, like, the ideas around, the possibilities that can be enabled by a wallet-centric future. So we have protocol-driven marketplaces here, meaning that, with the presence of something like Uniswap or SudoSwap, the idea of having, a set interface and a centralized platform is less attractive. Like, in reality, if you were to think about a more liquid labor marketplace, it could potentially be more decentralized and really be driven, and the incentives really be driven by the protocol, with kind of incentivized players helping verify the quality of labor, and the referrers helping, curate the network of talent as well, where, it's less so about the platform, but more about the individuals that are actually curating a talent marketplace, which is a very exciting feature. And then we have the idea of when you participate actively in the protocol and, when you actively participate in a DAO, how that on-chain action actually broadcasts to the entire network. And that becomes your reputation that we've, traditionally been outsourced to a lot of Web2 platforms like LinkedIn or Upwork. And then the other interesting things are, like, blurring lines between selves and groups. So as an individual, and as an individual who possesses a wallet, like, you can sometimes also represent a DAO. And the idea of being wallet-centric, kind of creates the possibility of one person creating 6 and 7 wallets and representing different selves in different groups, group identity, if you also have a multi-signature wallet. And of course, like, it's this kind of absolute kind of ownership over your work history and provenance, which is a lot of times not true right now. But the possibility of it is immense when, like, what does it mean philosophically when you actually have true ownership of, a lot of the things that you've done on chain. And the last piece, which is very interesting, is, like, when, in the traditional corporation, you get onboarded, you become, a worker, an employee of this company. And that means that you have the permissions and access to its set of tools, benefits, and all the implications of someone becoming an employee. But what does that mean when someone becomes a member of many DAOs and many communities? And how does that status translate between tools and tools as we, are moving into this more multi-client future, and with protocol kind of at the center? And then, of course, with the coordination rails, also will look different when the lines between organizations start to blur. Like we see, pods as a very popular concept, like popularized by Orca Protocol, now called Metropolis, where we see this idea of like your self-identity being represented by a pod that's registered on chain. And that kind of gives you access to a bunch of different, again, like other tools or information that otherwise you do not have access to. So looking at this whole stack, we see actually a lot of fragmentation across these, across the whole stack. So, right now we kind of see this fragmentation of identity and reputation and knowledge because a lot of the work is still being performed in Web2 platforms, so that, after you write amazing posts on discourse, like that post would not be associated with your identity when you move to another platform. And, the lack of data interoperability is a part of that issue. We see a lack of accountability, meaning that like if a bunch of pseudonymous people are working together, there's really no way to enforce that something is going to happen. And the consequences, are also, it's very hard to enforce. And even if we have accountability mechanism, right, like when there's dispute, Aragon actually did a lot of innovation here where they have a dispute court called Claros, I think. Actually, Claro is another project, but they basically create decentralized dispute resolution kind of channels. But right now, those channels are not properly incentivized either. So that there's still, like, I think a lot to be done there. And we're still super early in this future. But without these very core infrastructure, I think we're still pretty far from like kind of entering to this future. But with that said, some teams and some people are already living in the future. And then we have some examples here. So on the base layer, these are examples of escrow contract and backward compatibility, compatible contract that are created by LexDAO. They're super dope, like strongly recommend taking a look. We have identity layer that, is being designed by teams like Guild and some other teams being mentioned here. Really, the idea is that, once you are part of a DAO, like then, that identity of yours can be carried to any other applications that you interact with on the blockchain, on Ethereum. And then we have a coordination layer, which really is about embedding incentives when you perform a piece of work. And Gitcoin is a great example. There's already a talk on Gitcoin that was amazing, that talked about how, the Gitcoin's vision is really building this open grants protocol where, there's the kind of number of reviewers of, grants are kind of scale linearly with the people that are applying for grants, that are designing grants. So there's some very exciting feature there. And then we have tools that are very tactical, like Wonderverse, which, is building a bounty board where after you perform a task, you automatically get paid as well by the work you do with like very granular, with the very granular ability to get like attributed both credit and also rewards. And putting a lot of things together and kind of share a little bit towards the end of what we've been building at Station, really kind of how we've been thinking about this is protocol at the center, and really think about, what are the universal data structures that can be leveraged both by us, but also by others, to build different type of creative clients to establish these trustful relationship on chain. And, on the client side, we have a very friendly app that allows anybody to propose to another person to work together in Web3. So if I know your ENS address, I can send it to you and be like, hey, like, do you want to work on this together? And define the terms of how the payment will be issued, like milestones, splits, vice versa. And then sign it to prove that, there's this public verifiable record on IPFS that, people can refer to if, were a agreement were to be breached. And then when those activities start to emerge, when people work together, in the use cases of, let's say, creator economy, like someone wants to engage, a community of fans, or in the case of a DAO where they're looking to sponsor, 100 developers to build on top of their protocol, and also involving the community in the decision-making process, we're seeing this emergent network of projects, protocols, contributors, voters that are all participants of this network that actually built a more decentralized reputation system that ideally in the future can replace, KYC, which crypto has a very ambiguous relationship with. So that's the end. Thank you so much for having me. I had a blast just talking through the very philosophical lens of the future of work on Ethereum. we can jump into any questions or ideas.
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. I appreciate you jumping through everything with us. And yeah, that was awesome. I think you touched on so many of the different I think opportunities for like where like this could be headed. And I think it's still very early. And I think at the end there you kind of tied it up with like what is some of the current work that's being done in the space. And even that work, it, frankly, is very early. Like I think there's like a lot of opportunity for like new things to happen in this space. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll jump into some of the ones that I had going through this. I guess like, from my perspective, when with DAOs in particular, one of the main things that I've seen as requests from DAOs is basically, for lack of a better way of putting it, like talent, people that are smart, that are capable of joining those DAOs and being able to execute things on behalf of the DAO. I know you talked a little bit about like how we're kind of adding more structure into DAOs, which will also kind of help run those more efficiently. And I think also Scott mentioned that as well as part of his presentation earlier today on the public good side. I guess like it seems like to me the early experimentation there is more on that if you had that kind of 4 Venn diagram image that you had, more on the kind of tasks and like very early work piece. What would you recommend right now to DAOs that are kind of like, what should they basically change structurally so that they can move like up a rank on that list of Venn diagrams?
That's a great question. I also touched very, very briefly about on this in the talk, where we start to see pods being a very popular structure among DAOs as like a subgroup, sub-working group. There's different names to it, but really it's just a group of people working together within the DAO and kind of give them the autonomy to make decisions kind of more in a more centralized way without compromising on the decentralized nature of the entire organization. So it's almost like there's some level of centralization on a local level, but keep the global level of the organization more decentralized to ensure that there's diversity of thoughts and opinions and no power is actually being over concentrated on the top. But in terms of day-to-day operations, we all know that like if it's truly decentralized, nothing gets done and not all decisions needs consensus. So it's much more frequent now. We see very, very centralized, almost like mini startups that operate within the DAO that kind of resemble this pod-like or working group-like structure.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely noticed that that's been sort of a pretty like consistent theme, even just through like the work that I was doing as being like an optimism delegate, like moving from just like everybody reviews all proposals to now they have working groups as of this iteration recently. I know Gitcoin's done a lot of work in here. ENS has done a lot of work here too. And yeah, it's been really exciting to see. I have like a bit of a prop, but I'm not going to like force you to speak on it because, but I just saw this really interesting tweet this morning. Not during the presentation, I swear, I was paying attention. A tweet from Shreyas, who helps run Llama, that like hundreds of people today, some pseudonymous, are earning a full-time income working for open source protocols, getting paid in open source money, often gaining ownership over governance decisions in these protocols. This is actually wild and underrated. I think this is also very wild and underrated. I agree with him. Here, I'm not going to ask if you agree or not. I know I'm putting you on the spot there, but I mean, I think like that's, part of the opportunity is that outcome, right, for everybody, where they're able to kind of participate in such a way and get access to permissionless money, permissionless work, and just be able to like be, part of this ecosystem. You could speak to that if you want to speak to it, but if not, then kind of my main question was just sort of like, he said hundreds of people, for that to be thousands of people or tens of thousands of people, they need access to kind of resources and things to kind of understand the space a lot better. What are some of the kind of resources that come to mind and places to start for people who are interested in having that outcome?
Totally. I think back to the city analogy, I feel like we first need companies to be built in the cities, like create jobs to actually have kind of people migrating to the city. So I think we're still so early in that process of like just not enough protocols that are profitable exist to generate enough value for them to employ like kind of new talent. But outside of that, I think a lot of the things that we mentioned in the presentation still hold true, where some of the base layer, like the financial legal infrastructure, the financial is the easiest part in crypto, but the legal also is one of the hardest. It's like, how can we be backward compatible, but at the same time leveraging the power of smart contracts to automate a lot of these like traditional, very like kind of costly processes that are really hindering, a lot of these developing markets to tap into, what America's legal system, despite having a lot of flaws, still enable, which is a very, very powerful system for capitalism to shine, to kind of enable that those economic opportunities for more countries as well.
Amazing. Very, very cool. Well, thank you so much for answering my questions there. I didn't see any new questions come in on the chat, but I did see a lot of great presentations. This is interesting, excited about this. So thank you so much for being a part of this, Tina, and for joining us for this chat. And yeah, if anybody else wants to chat with you in a different place, feel free to drop your Twitter handle, or I'll give you like the shout out so that people know where to find you. Go, where do we find you?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm FKPXLS, fake pixels, but without the vowels. So awesome.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Tina. Really appreciate you. And,
thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Okay, great. Awesome. And then we have 2 more talks coming up. So we heard Tina talk a little bit about accruing all of this sort of work that you're doing in a decentralized way on Ethereum towards identities and people having wallets being kind of the new primitive. That worked out really well because the next talk that we're talking about is by Wayne on the Spruce team, and Wayne's going to be chatting about Ethereum's identity layer, exactly kind of what that's implying. So maybe without further ado, I don't want to spoil anything, so maybe I'll just invite Wayne up right away. And Wayne, when you're ready, feel free to kind of share your video, your mic. There you are. Nice to see you. And yeah, really excited about this. I mean, I think identity is one of those things that the ecosystem has been working on for a very long time. And I think especially over the last couple of years, we've gained, I think, a tremendous amount of clarity on what that can look like, and what are the kind of different outcomes and impacts of having a fully decentralized identity can be. So maybe I won't spoil anything, but maybe just kind of hyping up this conversation a little bit. I'll turn it over to you.
For that. Yeah, and I think if you've been listening to Tina's talk, she does refer to this identity layer that stretches across on-chain activity, also stretches across off-chain activity. So I hope to just add to the discussion with what that identity layer can be, how wide and encompassing it can be, and how we start thinking about it.
Awesome. I'll let you share your screen when you're ready.
Yep, here it is. So Ethereum's identity layer. Let's start with pretty high level. What is identity? This it potentially could be a discussion that is for hours, right? But as developers and also people, we want to have a working definition. So when we say identity, at least it refers to something of the same semblance. So there are very technical definitions for what identity is. From ISO, the International Standards Organization, they formally define digital identity as a set of attributes related to an entity. I don't think it's false. I think it's true, but also it doesn't help us that much because then anything could kind of be identity. So at a place called the Internet Identity Workshop, highly recommend this conference if you're interested in identity, decentralized identity. I think OAuth 2 was invented there, or at least standardized by a lot of the folks who go there. What's happening next with decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, a lot of the same people show up there. So if you're very interested in identity, highly recommend it. It's in, I think, Mountain View twice a year. And they came up with a definition that identity is the way we recognize, remember, and respond to people and things. And it kind of adds an operative context to that. So it's not just a set of attributes related to an entity, but it's kind of what do you do with those attributes? Maybe some of those help with authentication. Maybe some of those help you, retrieve who you're talking about and make decisions on how you're going to respond, right? So with this context, I think it helps make a lot more sense. Brief history of identity through, let's call it Web 2 and Web 1, Web 0, back in ARPANET and whatnot. But typically, when you look at the traditional identity markets, they're divided for enterprise and for people. And interestingly, it's kind of converging. So if you've ever seen like OpenID Connect or OAuth 2 or LDAP for Active Directory, any of these things, this is kind of what the enterprise identity management and also some end user identities are talking about. So in the 80s, people needed to have accounts to log into time sharing systems or computer networks for their work. So we started to do identity management, sending emails around corporately, and that evolved into more complexity. People needed to also manage access. And then most recently, the trends have been why do people have those access? What's their title in that organization or credentials? What are their certifications that give them that access? That's a lot of what the, let's call it Web 2 identity landscape is looking at. And it's really related to compliance and insurance and all that. So from organically, people using identities on the internet, they had aliases and emails, right? And then you had all these services emerge in the 90s. You could go on BBS systems and have a certain alias there, or IRC, et cetera. 2000s, we saw the rise of social media and more data linked to people's identifiers. And of course, it's used for advertising, which funds a lot of the free platforms. And in the 2010s, we saw the emergence of sign in with your favorite internet giant, and as a convenient way to not have to remember a username and password, right? So that's kind of how the story is to date. And we're very excited about decentralized identity. A lot of those other structures are kind of top-down command and control. Either a company sets up everything, or maybe a large tech company decides how it's going to work with everyone. Basically, you can use open protocols and open standards towards that, but just like how we saw with SMTP and email, even though these are open protocols, they kind of converge to just a few entities who are the main implementers, and you can't even run your own email server, unless you really understand how email servers work and how not to get blocked. So we think that decentralized identity has to do with statements about reality by anyone, and that can include stuff that happens on-chain or off-chain. Statements about reality are things as basic as I live in this town, or so-and-so went to a certain school. And this Ethereum address has a certain balance, right? These are all statements about reality. Some of them can just live on-chain. Every time someone creates an Ethereum transaction, there's a signature involved, right? And something happens. The Ethereum blockchain can attest to the state of itself. You can look it up through an indexer, or crawl the transactions and understand the state of the system. And that's a statement about reality by Ethereum that is fully verifiable if you look at the signatures and the previous state of Ethereum, et cetera. There are also statements about reality that are off-chain that can be represented as JSON with a signature over it, or other formats. So things like there's a certain email associated to an Ethereum account, or there's a certain Twitter handle associated with an Ethereum account, Discord channels, et cetera. You can link these data together, but maybe it's a statement about reality. We say nothing about if it's true or not, right? So it really matters who's saying it. So if Ethereum's saying it and you have cryptographic evidence about an Ethereum address for Ethereum address's balance, maybe that's a very convincing statement. However, if someone says, this Ethereum address is corresponding to this person, and it's a rando who says that, maybe you don't want to trust it, right? So it really depends on who's making the statement and what kind of evidence they can present towards that. And how you interpret that is commonly called a trust framework in the world of identity. So like we said with the second definition, it's used to recognize, remember, and respond. So if you're building a dApp that is, trying to assemble a bunch of DAO hack victims into a support group, if they're not super wealthy from ETH, you might have kind of a rule set that uses their digital identity assembled across on-chain and potentially off-chain activity, right? So WayneChain.eth, we check if they're a hack victim. That's something that you can just look up on the blockchain based on their activity. Previously, there was mentioned, your behavior on DAOs, your behavior in trading NFTs or anything else, staking assets. Those are all claims. Those are all statements that can be verified by the blockchain. Same with ETH balance. And you might have the user bring in their Discord handle. Maybe there's a witness that is able to attest that someone, made the identity proof. There was a project called Keybase that did this, and there are more open source ways to do this now. But basically, someone can prove that they have a certain Discord handle. You might have used Discord and one of the many plugins for Discord to demonstrate your Ethereum address ownership, right? And then all of a sudden, you're able to make that association. Well, what if you could also take that fact and it's signed and you can present it wherever you want? So with this set of details, you're able to recognize, remember, and respond from a combination of on-chain and off-chain data. So ultimately, the model we want to move to enable decentralized identity, so it's truly emergent and not just top down, we want, instead of the user logging into the platform or application, and then the application accesses its proprietary database, instead of that, we want the user to make the application log into their database and have all discretion over what's in there and how it's accessed, even revoking access or changing the scope of it as they want. This can contain those digital statements that are off-chain, and also the application can look up additional statements on-chain and form a comprehensive identity, but in a way that the user controls. It's like you start with a poker hand and you pick which cards you actually want to reveal, right? You don't need to just show everything all at once. If you put everything on-chain, it's bad for a lot of reasons, but that's one of them, because you don't get that level of control about what you want to reveal to the world versus not. Whereas if you're securely connected to an application and you have some degree of trust for the application, you may decide to disclose more data. And how the off-chain approach works, commonly a popular data model used is called verifiable credentials, which is a global data standard from W3C. And we have this so-called issuer holder verifier model. And this is, if you enter the world of decentralized identity and DIDs and whatnot, you'll see this a lot. But the issuer, such as a school, will issue credentials saying that perhaps this person has a bachelor's of science degree. The holder will be able to present it to a verifier who wants to know if that's true or not and who said it, maybe their employer. And they can be convinced that this person actually went to a school and got a degree, right? The really important thing that we care about in this model for decentralized identity is basically that the holder is isolated from all these other components. That is, we're moving towards user centricity or wallet centricity, in that these statements are held in the wallet in a way under the user's discretion. We don't want issuers holding all the credentials for people, and we don't want verifiers holding all the credentials for people. We want this idea of sovereignty, where the holder has discretion about where those credentials live, how they're secured, and how they're processed. This is what gives us more ability to choose what gets disclosed to whom. And finally, all this is coordinated with what's called a verifiable data registry. How do you know what are accredited institutions to accept things from, right? What stops someone from just spinning up a public-private key pair and starting to issue credentials? Well, there are these things called trust frameworks that can live in verifiable data registries that you can choose to accept. So you can say, okay, I like the trust framework that has all the accredited institutions by whatever body, or maybe for DAOs, there's a token curated registry of DAOs. And you're like, yeah, that's the trust framework. Any of those DAOs issuing statements, we can federate and accept statements from them, right? So these statements can be signed by Ethereum addresses and stored off chain. They can also be represented as Ethereum transactions too, but you wouldn't need something like verifiable credentials for that. You can just write a smart contract and conform to certain EIP, and that's it. So this allows us to have interoperability between claims made on-chain, but also off-chain, all rooted in Ethereum addresses or even a DAO issuing them, right? So this gets us the spectrum of it. It increases user control, and as a result, we get privacy too. So as a result, not your keys, not your crypto evolves into not your keys, not your identifier, whether your refers to someone who has a private key for something, or a collective with a multi-sig that controls a DAO-based identifier, such as a Gnosis safe address. And I think that the keys, users having keys is one of the really critical junctures. A lot of people have thought about this model where you can sign things off digitally in your keys and you have a lot more digital rights as a result. Well, seeing this critical mass adoption of MetaMask and other Ethereum wallets into the tens of millions, we are able to lean on a lot of what they've done, including key management, which is one of the toughest problems in decentralized identity. What if you lose your keys? What's at stake here? That's a tough problem. And many wallets are working on this. Some other interesting approaches use smart contract wallets, EIP 1271, such as Argent, becomes a really nice UX. And most of the time, wallets today are used to sign blockchain transactions. But we think that there's a lot more possible. If you squint and you look at this as the most successful public key infrastructure adoption event ever, what else can you do? Well, one thing that we can do with keys is authentication. You can sign something to prove that you're the account holder, right? And that's exactly what we've done with Sign In with Ethereum. We collaborated with the Ethereum Foundation and defined a standard message format for how someone will use Ethereum accounts to sign into a website that's off-chain. This way, if you already have an Ethereum account, why collect an email and do that whole verification flow when already you can use that to sign into something, right? And instantly all your on-chain activity associated with that particular account is available for the site to, look at. Because you can have multiple wallets and multiple accounts, you're able to pick your different profiles. And with things like zero knowledge, you're able to add additional privacy measures. You might be able to spawn a new Ethereum address just for a website and use zero knowledge proofs to show that you indeed did have certain transactions. You're not going to say what the other Ethereum address was, but indeed you did that before. So this is the direction for basically new classes of dApps that will give you a richer experience because they know a bit more about, they're actually talking to the Ethereum account holder. This is different than Connect Wallet because with Connect Wallet, all you're doing is just telling the server, this is my Ethereum address, but you have no proof for it. Anyone can spoof that. But with Sign In with Ethereum, the server definitely knows they're talking to someone who holds the key because they were able to present a challenge and get a correct response from the account holder. So how it works is that we just standardized the message format. This has been going on for like 3-4 years already. People have been using authentication flows, but we just standardized what the message format was going to be. And it's heavily inspired by JSON Web Tokens, which is live in production across like billions of users probably, but we made it palatable to be displayed in wallets. So it's a rigid grammar, very little opportunity to inject malicious statements or anything. We intentionally made it that way. And basically, we add security features too once we standardize, and also UX improvements. So if a wallet is able to recognize this rigid message format, it can actually be smart enough to show a login dialog. So it really feels like you're logging in as opposed to just trying to sign a personal message. Additionally, we get important security properties. The most important one that we care about is called domain binding. So when it says domain wants you to sign in with your Ethereum account, let's say it's example.org, right? The wallet actually has an opportunity to check that it's coming from example.org over a TLS connection, right? And eventually, maybe as we move to peer-to-peer encrypted systems, they can check domain binding for that. But since most stuff is served over TLS today, we can check that. And you can know that you're not getting man-in-the-middle attacked with pretty high confidence, right? And this is a big problem for wallets and dApps that use this approach where you make someone sign a message and all of a sudden it can be forwarded to an attacker can forward that message, make the user sign it on the phishing site, and then pretend to be the user, right? This is really scary, I think, when you're trying to use that signature outcome to create new key material to encrypt stuff, for example, or generate new keys, right? Because without the domain binding, any phishing site could just recover your encryption keys. But if the wallet refuses to or gives a big scary warning, if it notices it's the wrong domain, then that actually really improves security properties. So if you're a wallet or working on one or know someone working on one, I would really love if you mentioned, hey, it'd be great if you supported Sign In with Ethereum because it's going to increase protections for your users. And we are collaborating with the MetaMask team on adding this protection for all MetaMask users, for example. And what happens after Sign In with Ethereum? Well, we think we start simple and make something that just works for people. And we've seen it take off with a lot of dApps using Sign In with Ethereum. And after that, we think that there's a really strong link to decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. Decentralized identifiers have a whole ecosystem of use cases. There are a lot of companies building open source software to work with decentralized identifiers. You can look into that spec if you're curious. And verifiable credentials are statements about reality. Our work with decentralized identifiers and Ethereum addresses is defining a DID method called DID public key hash, because most blockchain accounts, including Ethereum addresses, are hashes of public keys. So I call this the Oprah Winfrey approach to distribution, in which look under your seat, you already have a DID if you have an Ethereum address. We just defined a way to make all Ethereum addresses valid DIDs. And you can further define signing methods so that you can issue credentials with them. So you can imagine a decentralized social media network that every time you click follow, you're actually in the background signing a verifiable credential, issuing the fact that you followed someone, and they get a copy and you get a copy, right? And maybe there's a revocation list in there too, in case you decide to unfollow them. But with this, you have a portable social media, a collection of signed JSON. Every signed JSON represents a follower you have or someone you followed. And you can take this with you to anywhere else. And if you follow those verifiable credentials down to who signed it, it's the actual end users, right? It's not the platform that you're entrusting as the ultimate authority. So that's how we get to decentralized social media for follows, for blog posts, for likes. These things can be represented off-chain as verifiable credentials or on-chain as transactions. When you represent them off-chain, you can have much better control over your privacy, and we can define canonical ways to put them on-chain as you want to disclose them to everyone. Another exciting use case after signing with Ethereum is letting the user's smart contract govern the user's cloud infrastructure, meaning that if you have a smart contract that defines a list of hosts that you say are okay to do something for you, then off-chain, those hosts can recognize that list, and maybe that's where your data storage is, right? Maybe that's your storage locker. Look in the smart contract or my ENS name in the records, I'm going to have the hosts that are authorized to be my data vaults. And you might even be able to sign permission slips for people to take over to one of your hosts, signed by your Ethereum account, and maybe they can do something like upload a file or download a file. This is the architecture used in our project called Kepler at Spruce. And another thing that we're really excited about is we think that you're going to use keys for a lot of things. I think sessions, we might see fewer cookie-based sessions being used. If we can have session keys, we can interpret a sign in with Ethereum message as a delegation to ephemeral key in the DOM, just as a session key. That can be used to create transactions. That can be used to issue verifiable credentials. That can be used to access data. Anything that you would do with cookie checking now, we could just have these transactions that work off-chain, right, to services that can receive them. So when we assume that the world is built on PKI and everyone has a key, there's a lot that can shift in the infrastructure. And also it's a huge opportunity to empower the user instead of trusting a central intermediary. One innovation that we've created at Spruce towards this is called CapGrok, which stands for Capability Grok. Grok is a kind of a nerdy term for understanding something. As we understand sign in with Ethereum to be a delegation of privileges to a key to do stuff, we think it's really important that the user has an opportunity to understand exactly what permissions they're delegating. It's kind of like when you're linking your social media account to a different site, and basically it's asking you what's okay to share and what's not. Well, this interface is going to get more and more complex if you imagine that we live in a world where most of your stuff is stored in your own data vault that you have discretion over. How do we make sure that a user has informed consent and they're actually able to, understand what they're actually sharing? This is a huge problem. Like most people who read privacy policies or who read the word privacy policy, they think it means that, the company is going to keep their data private, but instead it talks about exactly how they're going to share their data, right? So how do we make sure that there is this holistic bridge between what's in the technical capability, the real access control, the permission slip that you're writing, and a user's opportunity to understand what's going to be shared and what can't be, right? So this way you can use your Ethereum account for a whole suite of off-chain services and designate access to other services. But it only works if the user can understand exactly what they're doing. And that is going to be one of the toughest UX challenges to handle, but one of the most important ones too. So based on this, I think we're going to sign in with Ethereum to the key controlled revolution. If you're trying to get started, login.xyz has documentation on how to integrate things. You can follow Spruce on Twitter at SpruceID. You can follow me on Twitter at WYCDD. DD is my favorite Unix tool, or connect with me on the coolest social media network, LinkedIn. But that's kind of it. I'm ready to talk about anything you want to, answer questions, etc.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wayne. I appreciate the chat here. And yeah, I mean, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, like we are on like the cusp of like this like really unique time where, I think we, like to your point, like everybody has a DID. Look under your seats, like it's all there, and it's time to finally use these in like really interesting ways. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting time. If anybody has any questions for Wayne as well, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll relay them here. But maybe just kind of get kicked off here. Like, I think like commonly, like when we think about like, especially like verifiable credentials and things like that, basically at some point, like when you go far enough down the stack, you need to have trust somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So like, if I'm, a student of Harvard or something, and I want to like verify that, like, and have a credential on my DID that proves that, I got a degree from Harvard, which maybe is something people would want to have. At some point, like down the list, like you have to trust like Alice at Harvard, who's issuing degrees to Bob. And at some point there's something there. So, given that that's the case, like how do you think about like establishing those trusts, and like what should that be look like to be like as trust minimized as possible? And like for those like actual credential people, like those people who should be giving like actual credentials, like Harvard, like that's a really useful use case. They should think about doing that. Like, what are some of the best practices that they can employ to like be as trust minimized as possible in that stack?
Yeah, great questions. Two separate ones that I'm going to tease out, but the first one is you're talking about trust anchors. How do we know who to trust to begin with, right? Like what does bootstrapping this look like? Very timely. I think on Monday, there's a conference called Rebooting the Web of Trust that is kicked off. Really interesting papers. Everything's open source and on GitHub there. But basically, a web of trust was kind of the traditional way to do this. Before we all consolidated on certificate authorities, right? There was something called Spooky, SPKI, Simple PKI, which worked like you shared a bunch of public keys and you didn't need a central authority. So it kind of, if you squinted, it was kind of like web of trust, right? And I think that a really important point is that it depends on what you're verifying. Like maybe you care about what a doctor says about your disease, but you don't care about what your chef says about your disease. So you have to care about like who's issuing the statement. Well, if it's an accredited institution like Harvard, there are existing trust frameworks in place. So for universities in particular, there's a group called IMS Global, and it's a consortium of all the accreditation agencies, and they decide what a transcript looks like together. So right now, a lot of it's just paper world, but if you move that digital into a trust framework, you could rely on that to get started. And in Web3, that's one critical role I see for centralized companies that have built a pretty strong brand. If you trust that brand to make statements, for example, Coinbase says this person has over 2 ETH in their account, right? Maybe you trust that from Coinbase. And then DAOs, I think, are also really important for this too. If Raid Guild says they did a project, then like maybe we trust that they completed it because they have a great reputation in the space for completing certain kinds of projects, right? And as other DAOs specialize, they might stake claims over certain kinds of statements that they can make. And I think that the brand for the issuer is really important to consider as part of it. And that kind of leads into the other question, as an issuer of these things, and trying to implement these credential frameworks, what should you think about? Well, I think it's really useful to think about it through this issuer, holder, and verifier model. And usually the hardest part to bootstrap is the issuer, but what makes the model work is that someone wants it to verify something, right? So if liquor store wants to verify your age so that, or like that you're over 21 so you can buy liquor, well, that's the demand. And who's going to say that? Who does a liquor store trust, right? So if you start from the issuer's perspective, you can think about the data that you have that people would trust you to say as Harvard. And that's probably a really broad scope of things. And because Harvard is a strong brand, maybe they can even reach outside of academia a bit, but that's probably, where their bread and butter would be. So if you're a DAO working on like future of work stuff, and you have like a collection of completed projects as anointed by the multisig, well, you can issue certificates of completion to people. In fact, you can even help preserve their privacy because you can cut a new credential to an uncorrelated Ethereum address. You can say, yeah, this person did a medium-sized job and it was successful. And we're not going to tell you the addresses involved. There's like thousands of medium-sized jobs accomplished, but that person can use that credential and access something else without necessarily revealing too much.
Gotcha. Okay, very cool. Yeah, and I think that it's very, very interesting to think about this because, yeah, I mean, you have this sort of, I never actually heard this term trust anchor before, but it works really well for this concept. And I'll take a look at some of the other stuff you mentioned there too. Yeah, I mean, you have this existing even in like the traditional paper world. Like if you think about it, like your birth certificate is basically the trust anchor that sets up everything else, right? And there's like a lot of like kind of interesting parallels there. So yeah, it makes sense that there's already been some kind of work done in this space, even existing systems that we have.
Yeah, and what we're really excited about as we transition to the digital world for it, and there are things to avoid too, but what could be the case is that there was some mention in the previous talk about there's an interesting relationship between crypto and KYC, right? And potentially replacing KYC with something else that also reduces fraud and other things that we don't want. And well, when you represent things digital, it's a lot more inexpensive to do that. So if you have a bunch of other facts about yourself that together have the same level of assurance as like a passport or something, you don't even have to identify who you are, then that could be very interesting to preserve privacy, to increase user autonomy, increase equity. Some people have issues getting passports, for example, and if they need to access services, right, what are other pieces of data that could convince someone to give them access to services? If it's digital, it's a lot cheaper to think about those data, how to represent them and how to present them.
Yeah, and more efficient. You can more easily establish these things. Gotcha. Very cool. Awesome. Okay. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. I know we're already over a bit, but yeah, really appreciate you being here, Wayne, and thank you for walking us through that. And like I said, very exciting time to be thinking about this tonight. I guess there's even more stuff to watch next week in this regard as well. So
thanks so much for
awesome.
having me.
Thank you for being here. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. And we are going to move on to our last talk in just a minute. We're going to go for a quick 5-minute break. And we're going to be back at 4:15 p.m. Eastern, which is in about 5 minutes, as I mentioned. And we're going to be joined by Camilla Russo from the Defiant, who's going to be talking about how Ethereum is impacting creators, and especially how that's been affecting her life as a producer of a new documentary that's coming up on Ethereum's foundation. So stick around with us. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. And we're really excited to have Cami speaking at this event. Hey, everybody. Excited to be back. Hope you enjoyed some lo-fi beats during that break. And yeah, really excited to say that we have Camilla Russo with us, who's going to be joining us in just a second. When I was thinking about putting together the summit, one of the key ways in which Ethereum has had a huge impact and the key people that they have as creators. And Camilla's been a creator not only as a journalist, but also in her work at The Defiant, and also now as a producer of an exciting new documentary that's coming up, or actually full exciting feature-length film that's coming up, actually, not a documentary, about the creation of Ethereum. So instead of making myself look like an idiot on stage, I'll just invite Camilla up right away to chat about this and her work, both on the documentary and how Ethereum's been able to impact the creation of it. So Camilla, when you're ready, feel free to share your video, share your audio, and really excited to have you join us on stage.
All right. Hi. Is this
Hey,
working
Cammy.
okay?
Yeah,
All right.
everything's great.
Okay, cool. Super excited to be here. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, and it's really crazy that I'm seeing my book being turned into a movie. So yeah, excited to chat about that.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think on my side, I was really inspired to hear a bit about just the process of turning from journalist to basically company startup creator to then now book writer, and now movie producer. I think this has been a crazy journey. Maybe it'd be great to kind of walk through a little bit on the timelines of kind of how you just started out and just kind of getting into it, and then we'd love to kind of dive a little bit more into kind of the new stuff that you've been working on. But I think it'd be great to just for everybody to recognize how quick that journey was for you, to go and just kind of get a sense of those milestones for you.
Yeah, sure. So my background, I'm a journalist. I started my career in a newspaper in Chile, but then I came to the US and was at Bloomberg News for 8 years, covering all sorts of markets. It was based in Argentina, in Spain, and in New York, where I'm at now. And my final 2 years at Bloomberg were focused on crypto. I actually kind of wrote my first crypto story in 2013 in Argentina about kind of this growing Bitcoin community there, but was able to really focus day to day in kind of the crypto beat starting in 2017, and then covering kind of all the craziness of that time. Everything was really boring in comparison, and decided I would just stay in crypto, and that's where kind of the idea of the book came about. So this was end of 2017. I had always wanted to write a book, and I covering crypto, it was like there has to be a book idea here somewhere. And I started thinking about what the biggest stories in the space were. And it was pretty clear that was Ethereum, that there was a gap there in that there were no books on Ethereum at the time, or at least no books kind of telling the story of how Ethereum had come to be, how it was founded and created. And so I decided to take that on. And that's kind of how the book idea came about. And luckily, found a publisher, HarperCollins, interested in seeing it come to life. And then, started working on the book all through 2018, and left Bloomberg in January of 2019 to finish writing The Infinite Machine. And because, I had been kind of at the same spot for too long, for 8 years, I decided I wanted to be an independent writer. And then, that kind of evolved into just the idea of The Defiant. So The Infinite Machine and The Defiant are pretty kind of tied, because it was researching for The Infinite Machine that, I was following the Ethereum community around, all the hackathons, all the ETH Global hackathons, conferences, and just like was seeing all this innovation coming from the Ethereum community, and especially DeFi emerging. And I realized like it was super undercovered. Like to me, DeFi in 2019 was by far the most interesting thing happening in crypto. And so I decided to start a DeFi focused newsletter with the Defiant in June of 2019. And yeah, that really stemmed from my research of the Infinite Machine. So that's kind of how, everything came together.
Amazing. And I think, the timing of that should be noted that, like, I think, to recognize that DeFi was, such an important part of this ecosystem. I think in a lot of ways, like, early, right? Like I think 2020 is like when DeFi summer hit, and it was, absolutely chaos. And, a lot of people were, it was just like an amazing period of like, explosion of new things happening in DeFi. But, to have noticed that a year early, and then, be I think in the right position and have built the brand over that year in between to be able to like really report on everything that was happening in a really like measured way, I think was, something that the ecosystem really needed in summer 2020 and of course beyond. But yeah, I mean, it was amazing to have you be a part of that, and very helpful, I think, for the entire community.
Yeah, I'm glad. I really hope so. Like my goal with the Defiant was to bring the just like high quality, objective, unbiased reporting that I had learned at Bloomberg, bring that into crypto, and just focus it on specifically finance, which I think there are some great crypto media and publications out there, CoinDesk, The Block, they do great work, but I was seeing kind of this missing space of just like finance focused information and DeFi focused information that was really just like had really high standards. So yeah, that's what we've been trying to do at the Defiant.
Amazing. Well, I think you've been very successful in doing so. So it's very exciting to have seen that happen. And then as you were sort of kind of, in a way doing both of these, as you mentioned, they're very kind of interrelated, both the book and the Defiant. Like, I guess kind of curious, like, as you were going through and chatting with people and interviewing and meeting the community, and as you mentioned, for kind of working towards this book, like, I guess like what comes to mind is like maybe a story or an anecdote or something that you learned like as you were doing this that like you hadn't heard before, or that was like really unexpected, that like either was like really positive or really negative. I don't know, however you want to take it. But I guess like really curious, like what was like a really cool story that you had heard that you hadn't heard before while you were kind of researching for the book?
That's so hard. I think I did like over 100 interviews for the book. So let's see. Like to me, like when I was researching for the Infinite Machine, a lot of just like the Ethereum founding story. I had no idea. Like I came into this pretty, like knowing, of course, about Vitalik, like knowing just like what an exceptional and just charismatic person he is, and I thought like there's this really great character that can drive this story, and I knew some about kind of the other co-founders at the time. Like I had interviewed Charles Hoskinson for at Bloomberg, but I really didn't know about like all the drama that happened in Ethereum in its early days. And as a writer, I was like really happy to see that was the case.
Well, source material, right?
Yeah. So I guess like these things are well known now, but at the time, 2018, when I started researching for this, I hadn't seen this written anywhere. Kind of this tension between Ethereum being a for-profit company and a non-profit foundation, the fallout with kind of different factions between founders, kind of this what I call in my book, this kind of red wedding situation,
Yep.
all of that tension. I thought was so interesting, and kind of, at the core, it really spoke to just the values that later made Ethereum what it is. The fact that this vision for a nonprofit foundation, this open protocol, that vision for Ethereum was what finally kind of won out. Was of course what has driven and shaped the network and the community to be what it is today.
It's amazing to hear. Yeah, and definitely, like I imagine that sort of, I guess, kind of pivotal thing at the foundation story at the beginning. It does make for an interesting opportunity to write and be able to tell that story and that kind of foundation journey, a little bit of like a hero's quest in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I think just to kind of pause and reflect a little bit on that, the community is largely built up of at least at the beginning of kind of idealists, but largely just people who really excited about technology, and often weren't writers, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this in a way is a testament to the importance of having writers in the space to be able to go back and tell those stories, because at some point and that feels like now a long time ago, the kind of foundation story, but at some point the story of the merge, for instance, will need to be told in a much more cohesive, really easy way to read, and it's so fresh and so new right now. But it, of course, that's going to be a big kind of another big kind of pivotal moment in the Ethereum story. So yeah, I think just I guess a shout out to all writers, not just to you in this space, but just being able to tell that story for people who I would say are not often too worried about telling that story themselves. And I think it's still an important story to be told. Kind of maybe transitioning from the book to now your kind of new project that you're working on that you announced recently, which is the movie, or the adaptation of that book. I guess maybe it'd be cool to actually kind of hear a little bit more about kind of just how did that even start? How do you, I have no idea how to I don't know idea how to write a book. I have no idea how to turn a book into a movie either. So I guess how does that journey even start for you, and where did that begin?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been pretty crazy. I didn't really expect my book to be turned into a movie. I mean, I could only dream of that happening, and now that it is, it's really crazy. So basically, we published the book in July of 2020, and about a few months after that, I started getting some inquiries from a couple of movie studios about the rights of my book. So how it works is that the author usually owns the rights to sell their books to producers who want to turn that book into a film. And so I held those rights, and so I was getting inquiries as to potentially selling them to different movie studios and producers. So I had some initial conversations, and it was fine, but it was I didn't get a sense of these groups having a real understanding of what crypto was about, or just didn't see kind of a commitment to actually making it happen. My agent told me of all the movies that get sold, maybe 1% actually get turned into a movie. So it's movie studios kind of buy these rights as an option. So it's okay, maybe we will one day take this and turn this into a movie, but it's not a sure thing that if you sell your rights, your book will actually be shown on screen. And so that was really hard for me to decide. It's okay, do I give this up and maybe, you know, lose an actual chance of seeing this on screen. And then this Spain-based production studio reached out to me, and it was through someone who was like actually in crypto. Like he has to this day, like Francisco Gordillo has a hedge fund that invests in the space, and he's been kind of around since like 2014, like really kind of early on involved in crypto. So that was a really good sign to me. It's like, okay, they get it. They're like, you know, literally invested in the space. And they were also they also offered to make me a part of production. So they offered me an executive producer role in the movie. So even though, you know, they weren't like a Hollywood studio, I decided to go with them because I saw just like a bigger chance of my book actually making it to be a movie, and because I would be more involved in production. So that's how that happened. Still, you know, I was really clear with them, like, okay, I'll go with you guys, but I still want this movie to be like a Hollywood movie. Like I want this to be shown like all over the world. Like like I wrote this book for a mainstream audience and for this story to reach everyone, and so I want the movie to have like that same kind of impact. So like the big like the vision for this movie is for it to be like the social network but for crypto. So like, you know, a dramatized story that's meant to be like a blockbuster is kind of the big dream. So that's what we're going for.
Amazing. And I guess that has to be like a very I think like very emotional journey, I would imagine, because like the book, I'm guessing, is like, you know, you put so much work into that, you know, it must feel like in a way like, you know, a little bit of like a piece of you, right? And to then kind of license that out to somebody else where maybe you're not totally sure exactly like how they'll respect that, the amount of work that you put into it, honestly. Especially in the case where, like you said, I didn't know that like, you know, only 1% of these things get often turned into movies, these agreements. So yeah, I imagine that must have been quite an emotional journey to kind of go through, and I'm really happy to hear that you found somebody that you can trust, and also that you're part of the movie. I think in a lot of ways too, right? As a producer, maybe we were speaking to like what kind of influence and maybe kind of impact you get to have as a producer, because I'm actually personally not too familiar either.
Yeah. So that's a good question, because I had no idea about the film world, but executive producer sounds like okay, like that should be at the top, but it really isn't. It's like
it sounds very fancy. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's really kind of when you're the producer, then you actually have like hands-on influence on how things are made. Executive producers are more like an advisor kind of role. So executive producers usually kind of help with bringing in investors or bringing in kind of their network. You know, it's like, okay, maybe they're really well connected with actors and they can get a good cast, or maybe they're well connected with investors, or you know, it's really like more of an advisor role, or maybe they can just like weigh in on the script, which of course like I want to do. Sure. But it's not like I don't get like a real say actually on how the movie gets made, but I do at least get a chance to kind of look behind the scenes at how it is getting made. So I'd rather kind of take that than nothing. So yeah, what it does is like I can be involved, and I am involved in the funding of the movie, and so we can get into that. You know how I wanted to bring in NFTs, and then I luckily get to at least look at the script and kind of give my opinion, although I am not kind of directly involved in writing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Gotcha. So yeah, every time I said producer so far, I suppose I should have said executive producer. because the fancier title means advisor instead of the actual.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, cool. Awesome. Learn something new every day.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect segue. I mean, I think, one of the reasons why I in particular thought about having you on was part of that kind of fundraising process, or even mobilizing the community that you've been able to build over the years to be a part of this movie. So yeah, maybe it makes I think totally makes sense to segue into talking a little bit more about that. Like, how, as you mentioned, did you use kind of NFTs and the community that you built over the years to be a part of this movie and be part of that journey with you?
Yeah, so when we started having kind of the first conversations about funding, I immediately thought we should do this with NFTs. Like, this is going to be the first feature film about Ethereum. We should bring in the Ethereum community and bring in Ethereum kind of technology somehow into the production process, and NFTs seem like a good fit. So the other producers agreed, and we started to brainstorm on how this NFT project would actually work. So that's kind of the genesis of that.
Awesome. And then, can you maybe speak more to, like, maybe even just the thought process about that? I know that, over the last couple of years, like a lot of creators, like individual creators have basically gone through this exact mental math of just sort of like thinking about how they can, get their work into more of the hands of people that support them and do so in a more direct fashion, using NFTs, using blockchain, using different primitives to kind of do that. Maybe even diving into a little bit more about the different kind of options or different ways that people could help be a part of it through the NFTs that you were offering.
Yeah. So when we started thinking about the NFT side of like the movie, the first thing was like, we want these NFTs to be a way to involve the Ethereum community into the production process. So by giving these tokens some sort of utility or kind of reward attached to them. So what we decided is that we would treat these tokens as kind of backstage passes into production. And so there's like different Easter eggs attached to these NFTs. So, some of them will give you the ability to be named in the credits of the movie. So, your name appears at the end. Some of them give you an invite to the premiere of the film. Others give you make you an extra. There's like 20 NFTs that allow you to be an extra in the movie.
So cool.
Yeah, and what else? Oh, and there's also like an invitation to visit like a shooting location. So that was kind of our way of just like involving contributors to the funding process into production. I'll say that ideally, the kind of the obvious and right way, I think, to do this would have been to share kind of the royalties and actual kind of equity in the film with NFT holders. Of course, kind of discussing that with lawyers, it was like impractical to do. Nobody wants to go to jail, but it's this situation we're in with kind of like lack of regulatory clarity that we have to just like be careful how we do things. And so we found this way of like adding value to NFTs without having to just step into kind of murky regulatory waters. So that's kind of on the utility side. And then on kind of the actual just like visual aspect, like the design aspect, it's one of my favorite things about the project. So we decided on kind of this is the utility, And then I reached out to one of the people who had been involved in the creation of the Ethereum logo, and I thought, it'd be really cool if this guy also designs our NFTs.
Wow.
And then it happened that he is involved in a group of artists in Cuba. Like
Perfect.
he organizes these this group of artists together with a professor at the University of Havana, and they make sure that these artists are able to sell their work in kind of like a global market via NFTs. And I thought it was an amazing project. So I said, why not bring in this group of artists to make the visual kind of side of our project. And then we just decided to open up that process to any artist, but especially artists in emerging nations. So this is just like very close to me. Like, I'm originally from Chile. I lived a long time in Argentina, and I really do believe that crypto has the opportunity to actually change lives in emerging nations, and make a bigger impact. Like I like, of course, like in developed nations, crypto has the opportunity to like upend the financial system and make it much more efficient, and also be more inclusive. But for countries where you really have a deeply devalued currency, where you have currency controls, where you have extremely corrupt governments, that's where crypto can make an even bigger impact. So I just wanted to bring in artists from those areas and regions of the world, and provide kind of a platform for them. So
Amazing.
So we opened up the process for any artist to apply, and we ended up with a group of 36 artists from Cuba, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Kenya, India, and a few other places. And they designed the collection, which is each artist designed 10 versions of the Ethereum logo, and then we divided that into like mosaics, and then like programmatically combined these tiles. And so the result is like a really cool, just like explosion of Ethereum. It's like really colorful and different textures and styles. And it's just really cool. So really happy with how that turned out.
It's amazing. Yeah, I took a look at them after I saw you chat about this the first time, and yeah, they're absolutely beautiful. I think it's the mosaics of just explosions, like you said, of colors and shapes and everything. They're really beautiful. So that's awesome. And I think like one other thing that's like worth noting is that I just realized, like, I think you've been doing interesting stuff with NFTs for actually a while. Like, I remember one of the first NFTs I got, aside from like a CryptoKitty way back when, was when I pre-purchased your book in 2020.
That's right.
And you did these kind of voice notes for everybody and minted those as NFTs. And I remember that was the first time I ever realized that an NFT could be more than just like a picture. I didn't realize it could be also, so that was like a really cool unlock for me back then too. And yeah, cool, kind of like full circle there.
Yeah, you're right. I kind of like even forget that I did that. I did this kind of proof of pre-order.
It was awesome.
Yeah, you're right.
It was really cool. Awesome. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know that we're at the kind of scheduled time here, but well, thank you so much for being a part of this. I'd love to just give you a second if you can shout out where we can learn more about the movie, if there's any place that's like a resource for us to learn as we kind of wait for its reveal. But yeah, where should we turn to hear more about that movie?
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share. So we have like our website is theinfinitemachinemovie.com, and Twitter, I guess, is the other best place, at ETHmovie, and then you'll find links to the Discord as well.
Amazing. Okay, well, thank you so much, Camilla. I cannot wait to watch the movie, and thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks so much,
really
Jacob.
excited. And yeah, thank you so much. And I think that actually brings us to the end of our day today. So I'll just kind of quickly share. Thanks again, Camilla, for your time. And I just want to kind of give a quick overview for everybody else as a big thank you for being a part of this. Of course, if you're part of the hackathon that is going on right now, I do want to note that submissions are due on Sunday at 3 p.m. So get your pencils going and get your submissions in. You can start now. Submissions are open. And yeah, otherwise, happy hacking. And thank you so much, everybody, for being a part of this.
Nice. Thanks. And also good luck to everyone participating in the hackathon.
Awesome.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, Kevin. See you, everybody.